Imagine waking up in a world where your face could get you killed. Not because you've done anything wrong, but because you've done something far more dangerous in medieval eyes. You were born beautiful. Picture yourself in a small stone cottage, maybe 14 years old, catching your blurred reflection in a bucket of water, and your mother's face going pale. She sees what you're becoming, and in 1347 that's not a blessing. That's a death sentence waiting to happen. You probably think being attractive in the Middle Ages would have been an advantage, right? A ticket to a better marriage, perhaps some noble's favour, maybe an easier life. Think again. In a society built on rigid hierarchy, religious paranoia, and simmering communal jealousy, standing out for your looks was like painting a target on your back. Beauty didn't open doors, it opened investigations, accusations, and sometimes graves. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, wherever you are right now, whether it's a rainy Tuesday afternoon in Seattle or 3 in the morning in Melbourne, drop your location and local time in the comments. I always love seeing where this community spans across the globe. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing in your village and everyone knows everyone. That's how medieval communities worked. No anonymity, no privacy, just constant observation. And in that fishbowl existence, being noticed for anything was dangerous. Being noticed for exceptional beauty, that was practically suicidal. Because beauty in the medieval mind wasn't just skin deep, it was suspicious. The church taught that physical perfection was either a divine gift, which meant you should immediately cover it up and become a nun, or a demonic lure designed to lead men into sin. There wasn't much middle ground. If you were too pretty, you were either destined for the convent or destined for trouble, often both in that order. Consider what beauty even meant in this context. We're not talking about symmetrical features appreciated in vacuum. Medieval beauty was read like a text interpreted through layers of religious symbolism, humoral medicine, and social anxiety. A beautiful face wasn't just aesthetically pleasing, it was a sign of what that depended on who was looking and what they wanted to see. For the local priest, your beauty might signal dangerous vanity, the sin of pride-made flesh. For the village wise woman, it might indicate a humoral imbalance that would lead to fever and early death. For your neighbour, whose husband glanced your way too long, it meant you were a threat that needed neutralising. For the travelling merchant passing through it meant an opportunity for profit, whether you consented or not. The medieval world operated on a principle we've largely forgotten. Visibility equals vulnerability. In a society without photographs, without mirrors in most homes, without any real concept of personal image control, your face was your fortune and your curse. You couldn't curate it, couldn't filter. It couldn't control how others perceived it. You just had to live with whatever genetic lottery you'd won and hope it didn't get you accused of witchcraft before your 20th birthday. Historical records from across medieval Europe show a consistent pattern. Women described as exceptionally beautiful appear in legal documents far more frequently than their plain counterparts. Not because they committed more crimes, but because they were accused more often. Beauty was evidence. Of what crime, that varied. But the accusation came first. The specific charge could be determined later. And here's where it gets really twisted. The very same features that might get you accused of witchcraft in one context could be praised as saintly in another. The difference: control. A beautiful woman under church authority, properly cloistered and supervised, was a testament to God's artistry. That same woman walking freely through the village, drawing eyes, and disturbing the peace was a weapon of the devil. You can see the problem, right? You don't get to choose your face. You don't get to decide whether your features fall into the acceptable range of pleasant but not threatening versus dangerous, therefore suspicious. You just wake up one morning, realise you're turning heads, and understand that your childhood is over and your real problems are just beginning, historians still argue whether medieval people were actually more superstitious than us, or whether we've just transferred our irrational fears onto different targets. But one thing is certain, in a world where most people lived and died within 20 miles of their birthplace, where everyone knew your business, and where religious and legal authority were often the same people being too memorable, was genuinely dangerous. So as you drift off tonight, think about that young person standing by that bucket of water, seeing their reflection, and feeling their mother's hand grip their shoulder just a little too tight. Think about living in a world where your greatest genetic asset was also your greatest liability, where being noticed was the last thing you wanted, because we're about to spend the next 2 hours exploring exactly how that played out, in all its paranoid, violent, tragically human detail. The church is watching you. Not metaphorically, literally. In medieval Europe, the church wasn't just a religious institution. It was the surveillance system, the social media algorithm, the cultural arbitrator, all rolled into one stone building at the centre of your village. And it had opinions about your face. You're sitting in Mass on Sunday morning, which isn't optional by the way, and you can feel Father Benedict's eyes lingering on you during the sermon about the temptations of the flesh. Coincidence? Absolutely not. The medieval church had developed an entire theological framework around physical beauty, and most of it was deeply, profoundly suspicious. Here's the core problem Christianity inherited from early church fathers like Augustine and Jerome, a fundamental distrust of the body. The flesh was weak, corruptible, a distraction from spiritual purity, and beautiful flesh that was the most dangerous distraction of all. Augustine himself wrote extensively about how physical beauty could lead even the most devout souls astray, pulling them from contemplation of God toward contemplation of, well, you. So if you're exceptionally attractive, you're not just pretty, you're a theological problem walking around on 2 legs. You're a stumbling block, a test of faith, a living, breathing temptation specifically designed to make holy men think unholy thoughts. And whose fault is that? Definitely yours, according to medieval logic. You should have been born plainer. The church's position was deliciously contradictory. On one hand, beauty was a gift from God. After all, God created everything, and surely divine creation included pleasant features. On the other hand, taking any pleasure in that beauty, or allowing others to take pleasure in it, was vanity and pride, 2 of the 7 deadly sins. You were supposed to acknowledge that God made you beautiful, while simultaneously acting as if you weren't. Try threading that needle when you're 15 and everyone's staring. Medieval sermons are full of warnings about beautiful women specifically. Preachers loved using Eve as the ultimate example, beautiful, tempting, and directly responsible for humanity's fall from grace. Never mind that Adam made his own choices. The medieval pulpit blamed feminine beauty for the entire mess. You could be minding your own business, and suddenly you're being compared to the woman who destroyed paradise. Jacques de Vitry, a 13th century preacher whose sermons survive in remarkable detail, told stories of beautiful women as cautionary tales. In one, a lovely young woman becomes so consumed by vanity that demons actually nest in her elaborate hairstyle. In another, a beautiful maiden refuses to cover her hair in church, and God strikes her with leprosy as punishment. Subtle, right. The message was clear: your beauty is dangerous. Cover it up, or suffer divine consequences. But here's where the church's paranoia gets really invasive. They didn't just preach about it. They had rules. Lots of rules. You were expected to dress modestly, which in medieval terms meant covering basically everything. High necklines, long sleeves, veils or wimples for married women, and for everyone an absolute prohibition on anything that might enhance or draw attention to your natural features. Makeup was considered borderline demonic. Using cosmetics meant you were trying to improve on God's work, which was both prideful and sacrilegious. A 14th century text warns that women who paint their faces are painting the devil's gateway and will be recognized in hell by their vanity. Using rouge or white lead powder, both common beauty practices among those who could afford them, could get you publicly denounced from the pulpit. And jewellery, forget it. That's just asking for a lecture about worldly vanity. There's a wonderful bit of medieval logic here. If you're naturally beautiful and you adorn yourself, you're being vain. But if you're plain and you adorn yourself, you're being deceptive. Either way, you lose. The only winning move is to dress like a potato sack and hope nobody notices you exist. Historians still argue whether priests actually believed beautiful women were more sinful, or whether this was just convenient misogyny wrapped in theological language. But for you sitting in that church pew, the distinction doesn't matter much. The result is the same constant scrutiny, constant judgment, constant reminders that your face is a problem that needs managing. The confession booth became a particular nightmare for beautiful young women. Priests would quiz them extensively about vanity, about whether they enjoyed being looked at, about whether they'd taken any pride in their appearance. Some confessional manuals from the period specifically instruct priests to be more rigorous when questioning attractive female penitents, because surely they must be hiding sins of pride and temptation. And if you attracted the wrong kind of attention from a priest himself, well, that was definitely your fault. Medieval records are full of cases where priests were caught in inappropriate relationships with parishioners, and the women were punished far more harshly than the clergy. You tempted him, you see. Your beauty was a weapon you wielded irresponsibly. Never mind the massive power imbalance, never mind that he had spiritual authority over you, your face made him do it. The really dark irony is that the church controlled most education, most literacy, most record-keeping in medieval Europe. So the people writing history, writing laws, writing theological treatises were all celibate men who'd been trained to view female beauty as fundamentally dangerous. That's whose perspective dominated. That's whose fears became institutionalized. You're expected to be beautiful enough to attract a suitable husband, because marriage is necessary for social order, but not so beautiful that you cause disruption or moral panic. You're supposed to be modest about your looks while simultaneously making yourself presentable. You're meant to acknowledge God's creation while denying any pleasure in it. And all of this is being monitored, judged and recorded by an institution that sees your face as a potential gateway to damnation. Sleep tight, knowing that somewhere a monk is probably writing another sermon about how women like you are responsible for men's impure thoughts. The word witch hasn't been said yet, but it's hanging in the air like smoke from a pyre. You're 17 now, and 3 different people have made the sign of the cross when you walked past them in the market. That's new. That's bad. Welcome to the most dangerous intersection in medieval life. Exceptional beauty meets mass hysteria, meets legal systems designed to find guilt, not establish innocence. If you're unusually attractive, especially if you're also poor, unmarried, or in any way socially vulnerable, you're standing in the express lane to the accused witch's dock. And unlike modern legal systems with their presumption of innocence, medieval justice often worked backward. Suspicion was itself evidence. Here's how it typically started. Maybe a local man became infatuated with you and you rejected him. Medieval masculinity didn't handle rejection well, so he starts muttering to his friends that you must have used some kind of enchantment on him. How else could he feel this way? He's a good Christian man. These unnatural desires must be your doing. You've bewitched him, literally. Or maybe a woman's husband kept glancing your way, and now she's convinced you're using supernatural means to seduce him. Because obviously the only explanation for male attention is witchcraft, not the fact that her husband is, an adult making his own choices. But you're the easier target, she whispers to the neighbour, who whispers to the priest, who makes a note in his mental file of suspicious persons. The medieval understanding of witchcraft was deeply intertwined with sexuality and temptation. the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, published in 1486, but reflecting centuries of accumulated paranoia, explicitly connects female beauty with demonic power. The text argues that the devil preferentially chooses beautiful women as his servants because they're more effective at tempting men into sin. Your attractiveness isn't just a physical trait, it's evidence of a demonic pact. Think about the catch-22 here. If you're ugly, you might be accused of witchcraft because you're bitter and resentful, practicing maleficia out of spite. If you're beautiful, you're accused because you're obviously using supernatural means to enhance your looks, or because the devil has chosen you as his instrument. There's literally no safe zone on the attractiveness spectrum, and the evidence used against beautiful women in witch trials is almost comedic if it weren't so lethal. You smiled at someone and their cow died 3 weeks later. Witchcraft. You rejected a marriage proposal and the man later fell ill. You cursed him. A child cried when you held it. Obviously, the innocent infant sensed your demonic nature. You didn't cry when you held it. Proof that you lack human emotion, a known witch trait. Medieval legal thinking accepted what they called maleficium, the idea that witches could cause harm through supernatural means. But here's where beauty becomes especially dangerous. You didn't have to do anything. Just being unusually attractive was itself considered a form of enchantment. You were literally accused of witchcraft for the crime of having a face people found pleasant to look at. The sexuality angle made things exponentially worse. Medieval theology was deeply uncomfortable with sexual desire, viewing it as fundamentally corrupting, even within marriage. So when men felt sexual attraction, which, humans tend to do, they needed someone to blame. Enter the beautiful woman as scapegoat. She didn't just attract attention, she magically compelled it through demonic means. Court records from across Europe show this pattern repeatedly. A 1324 case in Kilkenny, Ireland involved Alice Keitler, described by contemporaries as unusually beautiful and charming. Among the charges that she used sorcery and potions to bewitch men into marriage. Never mind that she was clearly an intelligent businesswoman who managed her affairs well. Her beauty and success must be supernatural in origin. In 1428, a woman named Mattiuccia di Francesco was burned in Todi, Italy. The trial records describe her as having been remarkably beautiful in her youth, which was cited as evidence that she'd made a pact with the devil. The logic was circular and inescapable. Beauty attracted attention. Attention from men was seen as evidence of bewitchment. Bewitchment was proof of witchcraft. Historians still argue about how many witch trials were genuinely driven by supernatural belief versus how many were just social control mechanisms wrapped in religious language. But from your perspective, sitting in that village with people making protective gestures when you pass, the distinction is academic. The fire burns just as hot either way. The torture methods used to extract confessions were particularly cruel, and beautiful women often faced additional indignities. The swimming test, where accused witches were thrown into water float and your guilty sink and you're innocent but drowned, was bad enough. But beautiful accused women were also subjected to having their hair completely shaved ostensibly to search for the devil's mark, but really as a form of humiliation and disfigurement. Stripping and public examination was standard procedure in witch trials. The excuse was searching for that devil's mark, any mole birthmark or blemish that could be interpreted as the spot where the witch suckled her demon familiar. For beautiful women, this public humiliation served dual purposes: finding evidence and destroying the very beauty that made them suspect in the first place. The psychological torture was equally calculated. You'd be kept awake for days, questioned repeatedly about your beauty routine. Did you use herbs? That's potion making. Did you wash your face with special water? That's ritual purification for demonic purposes. Did you sing while you worked? Those are incantations. Every normal aspect of grooming and self-care could be reinterpreted as evidence of witchcraft. And here's a particularly nasty detail once accused your beauty actually made conviction more likely. Juries and judges were primed to believe that the devil rewarded his servants with attractiveness. So the very feature that got you accused in the first place was then used as proof of guilt. You literally couldn't win. Some women, seeing this trap deliberately disfigure themselves, will get to those stories later. Others went into hiding, entering convents, or arranging hasty marriages to men who might offer protection. But many had no options at all. They just waited, knowing that suspicion once planted grew like poisonous ivy. You lie in your straw bed tonight, listening to your mother pray louder than usual. Tomorrow you'll cover your hair more carefully, avoid eye contact, maybe rub some ash on your face to dull your complexion. Anything to be less noticeable. Because in a world hunting for witches, being beautiful is like being marked with a sign that says suspect here. You're 12 years old when the negotiations begin. Not negotiations you're part of mind, you negotiations about you. Your father is talking to a merchant twice your age, and your mother won't meet your eyes. You understand before anyone says a word. Your face just became a business transaction. Marriage in medieval Europe wasn't about love compatibility or even basic human decency. It was about property alliances and social advancement. And if you happened to be beautiful, congratulations, you just became the most valuable commodity your family owned. Which sounds great until you realize commodities don't get to choose their buyers. For poor families, a beautiful daughter was like winning a small lottery, the chance to marry up to secure connections with wealthier families to escape grinding poverty. The pressure was enormous. Your looks weren't yours, they belonged to your family's economic strategy, and God help you if you had opinions about who should benefit from them. A moderately attractive peasant girl might marry within her class someone local, someone she'd known since childhood. Not romantic, but relatively safe. But if you were exceptionally beautiful, that's when things got complicated and dangerous. Because now you'd attracted attention from men with actual power, minor nobility, wealthy merchants, landowners who saw you as an opportunity to acquire something pretty to look at, while also sealing some business arrangement with your father. The age gap was often horrifying by modern standards, but completely normal then. A girl of 13 married to a man of 40, standard practice. He gets a young, beautiful wife who'll bear him children and enhance his social status. She gets to survive, probably. That was often the best you could hope for. But here's where beauty becomes actively dangerous rather than just unfortunate. If you were pretty enough to attract attention from significantly higher social classes, you entered a nightmare scenario. Because cross-class marriage was technically possible, but socially fraught and often outright blocked by laws and customs. So what happened to beautiful peasant girls who caught noble eyes? Sometimes abduction, just straight-up kidnapping. Medieval law had this fascinating concept called raptus abduction for the purpose of forced marriage, and while technically illegal, it was often treated as a property crime against the girl's father, rather than a crime against the girl herself. If the abductor was wealthy or powerful enough, he might simply pay compensation to the family and keep his prize. A beautiful girl walking to the well or working in the fields was genuinely at risk of being grabbed and carried off by minor nobility or their servants. There are documented cases throughout medieval Europe of noblemen seeing attractive peasant girls wanting them and simply taking them. The girl's consent wasn't even part of the equation. And if your family tried to resist or seek justice, good luck with that. The legal system was run by the same class of people doing the abducting, a peasant family's word against a nobleman's. The outcome was predetermined. Your beauty had made you visible to predators with the power to act on their desires without meaningful consequences. Even when marriages were arranged through proper channels, beauty complicated everything. A girl too pretty might attract multiple suitors, leading to genuine conflicts between families. There are records of disputes, sometimes violent ones, between men competing for the same beautiful bride. And the bride herself, she had almost no say in which predator won the auction. Remember that medieval marriage often happened young girls could be legally married at 12, though consummation was theoretically supposed to wait until they were older. Theoretically. A beautiful 12-year-old was especially vulnerable because her value was highest before age, childbearing, or disease could diminish her looks. Families wanted to capitalize on that beauty quickly. The wedding night itself was often traumatic under any circumstances, but for girls married off young to much older men they barely knew. It was frequently their first real understanding of what their beauty had cost them. You weren't a person, you were an acquisition. Your husband had purchased the right to your body, your labour, your reproductive capacity and your decorative value at his table. Some marriages were genuinely brutal. Medieval law gave husbands extraordinary power over wives, including the legal right to correct them physically. A beautiful wife who didn't perform her duties enthusiastically enough might face violence with no real legal recourse. After all, she was property, and a man could do what he wanted with his property within fairly broad limits. But even in less violent marriages, beauty created its own prison. You were expected to remain beautiful for your husband while simultaneously not attracting any other male attention. You were supposed to be a prize he could display, but also a modest, invisible presence who didn't cause gossip or jealousy. These contradictory demands were impossible to satisfy. Historians still argue about how much agency medieval women actually had in marriage arrangements, with some evidence suggesting that in certain regions and classes, women had more say than stereotypes suggest. But for genuinely beautiful girls, especially poor ones, the evidence is pretty bleak. Your looks eliminated options rather than creating them, and if you refused, if you dug in your heels and said no to the marriage your family arranged, you'd likely be beaten into compliance, locked up until you agreed, or in extreme cases sent to a convent, which we'll discuss later. But spoiler alert, that wasn't necessarily an escape either. The really dark cases involved families selling beautiful daughters to men they knew were violent or disturbed but who paid well. A merchant with a reputation for cruelty toward his previous wives might still find a new bride if he offered enough money, and if that bride was beautiful, her family might overlook the warnings. Her beauty was worth more than her safety. Even in the rare cases where you might have attracted a decent husband, someone kind or at least not actively cruel, your beauty created ongoing problems. Other men's attention, other women's jealousy, constant social pressure, and the knowledge that you were valued primarily for your appearance rather than any other quality, this was the good outcome. Widowhood sometimes offered relief, but beautiful widows faced their own dangers. They were considered fair game by men seeking second or third wives, and without a father's protection, they were even more vulnerable to coercion or abduction. Some widows remarried quickly for protection. Others found themselves forced into arrangements they never wanted. You lie in your bed tonight, still technically a child, knowing that soon you'll be in some stranger's bed, legally obligated to submit to whatever he wants, your beauty having sealed your fate before you were old enough to understand what was being decided. Your mother tells you to pray for a kind husband. You pray just to survive whatever's coming. The baker's wife is smiling at you, but her eyes aren't. She's holding a loaf of bread and you're holding your coins, and there's something in the air between you that feels like the moment before a storm breaks. You've done nothing wrong, but you can feel her hatred like heat from an oven. Welcome to the most dangerous room in medieval life, the court of public opinion, in a small enclosed community where everyone knows everyone and jealousy ferments like bad ale. If you're beautiful, you're not just living among your neighbours, You're living among potential enemies who see your face as a personal insult to their own. Medieval villages were pressure cookers of human emotion with no release valve. You couldn't move away easily. You couldn't avoid people you hated. You saw the same faces every single day in the market, at church, at the well, at festivals. And if one of those faces was significantly more pleasant to look at than the others, that created tension that could simmer for years before boiling over into violence. Envy is one of the 7 deadly sins, but it's also one of the most human emotions, and in a world of limited resources and rigid social hierarchy, it was everywhere. The thing is, most medieval people couldn't do much about envying the Lord's wealth or the bishop's power, but they could do something about envying their neighbour's pretty daughter. The attack started small, usually. Gossip first whispered insinuations about your virtue suggestions, that your beauty must come from somewhere unnatural rumours, that you'd been seen talking to men unchaperoned. This wasn't harmless chatter. In medieval communities, reputation was survival. Destroy someone's reputation, and you destroyed their prospects for marriage work and social support. The gossip would spread like plague, mutating as it went. You smiled at the blacksmith. By evening, you've been having an affair with him. You wore a nice dress to church. By next Sunday, you're being accused of vanity and trying to seduce the congregation. You received a compliment. You clearly encouraged it through immodest behaviour. Women were often the primary agents of this destruction, which makes sense in a horrible way. Men had other avenues for competition and aggression. Women's power was largely social exercise through reputation management and community standing. A beautiful younger woman was a direct threat to older women's social position and their hold on their husband's attention. The baker's wife, the butcher's wife, the miller's wife, these women formed informal networks of social control. They decided who was respectable and who wasn't. They enforced community standards, and if they decided you were a threat, they had tools to neutralize you that didn't require physical strength or legal authority. Social exclusion was the first weapon. You'd arrive at the well to find the other women suddenly silent. You'd enter the church and find no one would sit near you. You'd walk through the market and receive cold stares instead of greetings. This might sound mild, but in a world where community membership was essential for survival, it was devastating. But sometimes envy escalated beyond social weapons into actual violence. There are documented cases throughout medieval Europe of women attacking other women they perceived as too beautiful. Acid or lye thrown in the face was not uncommon a quick way to destroy the beauty that caused such offence. A case from 14th century Florence describes a young woman named Lucia, whose face was deliberately scarred by a group of women who ambushed her on her way to market. Their stated reason: she was too beautiful and caused strife among the married men. They weren't punished, incidentally. The community consensus was that Lucia had brought it upon herself by being insufficiently modest about her looks. Poisoning was another option, especially in communities where women had knowledge of herbs and plants. A beautiful young rival could be given something that would make her sick, cause her hair to fall out, ruin her complexion. These attacks were nearly impossible to prove and often dismissed as natural illness. The most insidious form of attack was sabotage of marriage prospects. If a beautiful girl was being courted, older women would whisper to the potential husband's family about her supposed moral failings, her mother's questionable reputation, rumours of madness in the bloodline, anything to poison the well. Beauty might attract initial interest, but reputation determined whether that interest converted to marriage offers. And husbands were absolutely complicit in this. A man whose wife was consumed with jealousy over a beautiful neighbour might decide the easiest solution was to eliminate the threat. He'd join the whispering campaign, or he'd do something more direct, make an accusation to the priest, claim the beautiful woman has tried to seduce him, anything to solve his domestic problem by destroying someone else's life. Historians still argue about how much of medieval violence against women was actually driven by gendered competition versus other factors like property disputes or religious fervour. But the sources are pretty clear that female beauty specifically attracted female violence in ways that other forms of distinction didn't. The really dark detail is that the community often supported these attacks, at least passively. A beautiful woman attacked or ruined was often seen as having gotten what she deserved for being too proud, too visible, too attractive. The assumption was that she must have been flaunting her looks, must have been inviting attention, must have been asking for it. Even your own family might not fully protect you. If your beauty was causing problems in the community, if you were creating enemies, attracting dangerous attention, becoming the subject of gossip, some families decided the solution was to get rid of the problem. Arrange a quick marriage to someone far away, send you to distant relatives, or in extreme cases encourage you to enter a convent. The kitchen was a particularly dangerous space. Women worked together preparing food with access to knives, fire-boiling liquids. Accidents happened. A beautiful young woman might find herself splashed with scalding water or suffering a knife wound that mysteriously marred her face. These incidents were rarely investigated thoroughly. There's a recorded incident from 13th century England of a young woman named Margaret who was deliberately pushed face first into a cooking fire by 3 other women. She survived but was permanently disfigured. The attackers claimed she'd stumbled. The community accepted this explanation despite multiple witnesses suggesting otherwise. Margaret's beauty had made her a problem. Her scars solved that problem. Food tampering was another risk. A beautiful girl might find her portion at communal meals contained substances that would make her violently ill, cause skin problems, or worse. The person serving food had enormous power, and if that person harboured jealousy, you were vulnerable every time you ate. The feast days and festivals, which should have been celebrations, became minefields. These were times when the whole community gathered, when ale flowed freely, when tensions that simmered quietly might suddenly erupt. A beautiful young woman at a festival was at risk from drunken advances from men and drunken violence from women who had spent months or years nursing their resentment. Even children weren't safe from this dynamic. A beautiful child might be targeted by adults who saw future competition, or by other children encouraged by jealous mothers. There are records of young girls being deliberately injured in ways that would affect their adult appearance, scars placed carefully to mar future beauty. You go to sleep tonight checking that your door is barred not against strangers but against neighbours, against the baker's wife with her dead eyes, against the smith's daughter who stopped speaking to you last month, against the women at the well who went silent when you approached. Your beauty has made you an outsider in your own community, and in a medieval village there's nowhere lonelier and more dangerous than that. You're 14, and you've just been hired as a serving girl in the manor house. Your mother cried when you left, but not from sadness, from fear. She knows what happens to pretty girls in houses full of men with power and no accountability. She's given you a small knife to keep under your skirt. You both know it won't be enough. The medieval household was a trap for beautiful servants, especially young ones. You were hired specifically because you were pleasant to look at. Nobles liked having attractive people serving their meals, pouring their wine, making their beds. But that same attractiveness that got you the job also made you pray for every man in the house who decided he wanted you. Let's be clear about the power dynamics here. You're a servant. You own nothing, earn almost nothing, and have virtually no legal rights. The lord of the manor, his sons, his guests, even the higher-ranking male servants, all of them outrank you so completely that you might as well be furniture. Furniture that they're legally and socially permitted to use however they want. The advances started immediately, didn't they? The lord's eldest son brushing against you in the corridor, his hand lingering too long when you served his wine. The steward cornering you in the pantry with comments about your pretty face and fine figure. the visiting knight who summoned you to his chambers at night for services that had nothing to do with bringing fresh linens, you couldn't refuse. That's the crucial detail modern people often miss. No wasn't an option. Refusing a nobleman's advances could get you dismissed without references, beaten, or worse. Some serving girls who rejected their employer's sexual demands found themselves accused of theft and punished accordingly, a convenient way to remove a girl who wouldn't cooperate while simultaneously ruining her reputation. But accepting wasn't safe either. If you submitted to the Lord's son, you became a threat to his future marriage prospects. If you became pregnant, you were evidence of his indiscretion. Either way, you'd likely be discarded, sent away without pay, married off hastily to some peasant who'd been paid to take damaged goods, or simply thrown out to survive however you could. The lady of the manor was often your worst enemy, not your protector. She knew exactly what her husband and sons were doing with the pretty servants, and her solution was usually to get rid of the servants, not reform the men. A noblewoman had limited power over her husband's behaviour, but she had complete power over who worked in her household. There's a documented case from 14th century France of a serving girl named Jean, who caught the eye of her employer, a minor nobleman. When his wife discovered the affair, if you can call coerced sex an affair, she had Jeanne beaten, branded on the face as a prostitute, and thrown out of the manor in winter with nothing. The husband faced no consequences. He just found another pretty servant. The kitchen was particularly dangerous because it placed you in close quarters with multiple men, cooks, scullions, porters, and gave them opportunities to corner you away from public view. The head cook had tremendous authority over lower servants, and a beautiful scullery maid might find herself receiving unwanted attention from someone who controlled her work assignments, her food portions, and her sleeping quarters. Night was the worst time. Servants often slept in communal spaces or small chambers near their work areas. You had no lock on your door, no private space, no way to secure yourself. If someone decided to visit your sleeping space after dark, you were entirely vulnerable. Screaming might bring help, but it might also bring accusations that you were disrupting the household. Some noblemen treated their right to sleep with serving girls as a kind of feudal privilege, barely distinguishable from their rights to collect taxes or dispense justice. You were part of the household resources available for use. There's a chilling casualness in some medieval household accounts about serving girls who became pregnant. They're noted as expenses problems, to be resolved not as human beings who'd been violated. Historians still argue about how common sexual exploitation of servants actually was, versus how much of our understanding is shaped by sensationalized accounts. But the legal and social structure made exploitation so easy and consequence-free that it seems naive to imagine it wasn't widespread. And if you did become pregnant, that was your problem entirely. The father might acknowledge the child if he felt generous, providing some small payment, or arranging a marriage for you with one of his peasants. But he was under no legal obligation to do so. You might find yourself dismissed while pregnant, left to give birth in whatever shelter you could find, your beauty having destroyed your life before you turned 16. Even if you avoided pregnancy, the constant harassment took its toll. You learned to move through the manor like a shadow eyes down, trying to be invisible despite the fact that you were hired specifically to be visible. You learned which corridors to avoid, which times of day were most dangerous, which men to never be alone with. The other servants weren't necessarily allies. Beautiful serving girls created resentment among plainer ones who saw you as competition for better positions, or ironically for the attention of the male servants they might actually want. You could find yourself isolated without friends navigating a hostile environment alone. Some girls tried to protect themselves through alliances, attaching themselves to a particular nobleman or higher servant who might shield them from others in exchange for exclusive access. This was a calculated survival strategy, not romance. You picked the least dangerous predator and hoped his protection was worth the price. The lady's chamber was supposedly safer, serving the noblewoman directly rather than being available to the general household. But even there you were vulnerable to her husband's visits, her son's wandering and her own jealousy, if you were too attractive. Some noble women deliberately hired only plain or elderly women for their personal service to avoid competition. Laundry work was considered one of the safer jobs because it often took place in separate buildings, with primarily female staff. But even there you weren't secure. Delivery of linens brought you into contact with the main household, and your beauty made every interaction a potential threat. The truly insidious part was that your employer could destroy you on a whim, even without sexual motivation. If you displeased him, if you broke something valuable, if you were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time when he was in a bad mood, he could have you whipped, dismissed, or accused of theft. Your beauty made you valuable, but also made you threatening. And threatening servants didn't last long. Some serving girls eventually married and escaped service, but beautiful ones often found that their years in a noble household had ruined their reputations. Local men assumed you'd been sleeping with your employers often correctly and didn't want soiled goods. Your beauty had gotten you the job that destroyed your marriage prospects. You lie on your thin mattress tonight in the servants' quarters, listening to footsteps in the corridor, trying to determine if they're passing by or stopping at your door. The knife is under your pillow, though you know using it would mean your death, even if you survived the encounter. Your beauty opened this door, and now you're locked inside with wolves who call themselves lords. You've saved enough coins to buy a nice wool cloak dyed a rich blue that makes your eyes look even brighter. You wear it to market exactly once before the bailiff stops you in the street demanding to know who you stole it from. You didn't steal anything, you just made the mistake of looking too good for your station. Welcome to the bizarre world of sumptuary laws, legal codes that literally dictated what you were allowed to wear based on your social class. And if you were beautiful and poor, these laws became another weapon aimed directly at your throat, because looking good while being the wrong class was essentially a crime. Medieval Europe was obsessed with visible hierarchy. The social order wasn't just enforced through violence and law. It was supposed to be readable at a glance. Nobles dressed like nobles, peasants dressed like peasants, and everyone should stay in their lane. Beauty complicated this system because an exceptionally attractive peasant in decent clothes might be mistaken for minor nobility, and that confusion threatened the entire social structure. Sumptuary laws varied by region and period, but they shared common themes: restrictions on fabric types, colours, fur trimmings, jewellery, and even hairstyles based on social rank. In 14th century England, for example, peasants were forbidden from wearing certain colours like purple or gold, or fabrics like silk and velvet. In Florence, there were laws about how many buttons you could have on your sleeves, for God's sake. But here's where beauty made everything worse. A plain woman in a nice dress was breaking sumptuary laws. A beautiful woman in a nice dress was assumed to be a prostitute, a nobleman's mistress, or a thief. Because how else would someone like you afford nice things while also looking that good? Obviously through immoral means. The logic was circular and inescapable. If you're poor and beautiful and well-dressed, you must be earning money through sex work. If you're dressed above your station, you're either stealing, lying about your social rank, or being kept by someone wealthy. Your beauty itself became evidence of moral corruption when combined with any material comfort. Prostitutes were often required by law to wear distinctive clothing or badges to mark them as such, different coloured hoods, specific types of fabric identifying symbols. The stated purpose was to protect virtuous women from being mistaken for prostitutes. The actual effect was that any beautiful woman who dressed nicely could be accused of prostitution based solely on her appearance. There's a fascinating, by which I mean horrifying, case from 15th century Venice. where a woman named Lucia was arrested for wearing silk despite being a baker's daughter. She protested that her husband had bought it for her, that she'd broken no laws. The judge's response: a woman who looks like her dressed like that must be engaging in immoral behaviour to afford such things. She was fined and publicly shamed. The authorities didn't even need to prove prostitution. Looking too good while being too poor was itself suspicious enough to warrant punishment. And beautiful women were especially vulnerable because the authorities found it easier to believe that men would pay for their sexual services. Even if you were completely virtuous, married, working honestly, your beauty combined with any nice clothing attracted official scrutiny. The logic was that exceptional beauty gave you opportunities to earn money immorally, so if you had money to spend on nice things, you probably earned it that way. Never mind that you might have been saving for months or that a family member gave you a gift. The enforcement of sumptuary laws was wildly inconsistent, which made them even more dangerous. A beautiful woman might wear the same dress for months without problem, then suddenly face arrest because a bailiff noticed her, or because someone made a complaint, or because the authorities needed to make an example of someone. Some cities had officials whose actual job was to patrol and enforce dress codes. In Paris, sergeants would stop women in the street and inspect their clothing, checking fabric quality, counting buttons, examining jewellery. For beautiful women, these inspections often became harassment, with officials demanding to know who gave them such nice things, insinuating impropriety, sometimes demanding bribes to avoid charges. Historians still argue about how often sumptuary laws were actually enforced versus being merely symbolic. But the records show plenty of prosecutions, and beautiful women appear disproportionately in those records. Your looks made you a target for officials who assumed moral failing. The clothing restrictions also trapped you economically. If you were beautiful and trying to improve your circumstances through respectable work, you couldn't dress the part. Trying to look professional or successful in business could get you arrested. You were supposed to remain visibly poor even if you weren't anymore. Some women tried to navigate this by dressing plainly in public, but keeping nicer clothes for private occasions. But this strategy had its own risks if discovered it looked like you were deliberately hiding something, which reinforced suspicions of immoral behaviour. The jewellery restrictions were particularly cruel. A plain woman wearing a simple gold ring might be ignored. A beautiful woman wearing the same ring would be stopped and questioned about where she got it, who gave it to her, why someone like her has gold. Your beauty transformed normal possessions into evidence of wrongdoing, and God forbid you receive legitimate gifts from employers or family members above your station. A noble woman might give a favoured servant a nice piece of clothing or a trinket. If you were beautiful and wore it, people assumed sexual favours had been exchanged. You literally couldn't win, refuse the gift, and offend your employer, accept it, and face public accusation. Hair was another battleground. Elaborate hairstyles were restricted to upper classes, but if you were beautiful, even a simple braid could be seen as attempting to look above your station. You were supposed to keep your hair covered and hidden, because exposed hair on a beautiful woman suggested loose morals and vanity. The penalties for violating sumptuary laws range from fines to public humiliation to actual imprisonment. Some cities would cut off excess fabric from illegal garments in public, literally destroying your clothing as punishment and warning. For poor people, losing a good cloak or dress was economically devastating. The most insidious aspect was how these laws turned your appearance into perpetual suspicion. You couldn't dress down enough to be truly safe because your face still attracted attention. But you couldn't dress well without triggering legal consequences. There was no acceptable presentation for exceptional beauty in a society determined to keep everyone in their assigned place. Some beautiful women adopted deliberate dowdiness as protection, wearing the plainest possible clothes, avoiding any adornment, deliberately making themselves less attractive through presentation. It was a form of voluntary disfigurement, through fashion erasing yourself to survive in a system that criminalized standing out. You carefully fold the blue cloak and hide it at the bottom of your chest tonight. You'll never wear it again in public. You've learned your lesson beauty is conspicuous enough without adding nice clothing. The authorities are watching. The neighbours are watching. Everyone is watching. And what they see in you, no matter how you dress, is guilt waiting to be proven. The convent seemed like an escape. Your family presented it as an honour, a spiritual calling, a refuge from the dangers you faced in the world. You took your vows believing stone walls and holy sisters would protect you. You were wrong. Even here behind locked doors and beneath a veil, your face is a problem that won't go away. Medieval convents were supposed to be sanctuaries, places where women could escape the marriage market, the sexual economy, the constant male attention. And for plain or homely women, they often were exactly that. But for beautiful women, a convent could be just another kind of prison with its own unique torments. The first issue was why you were there. Beautiful girls often ended up in convents for all the wrong reasons. Your family couldn't afford a dowry large enough to marry you to someone worthy of your looks, so they paid a smaller amount to marry you to Christ instead. Or maybe your beauty had caused so many problems, attracted too much dangerous attention, created too much jealousy, that your family decided removing you from society entirely was the safest option. Some girls were sent to convents as punishment. You rejected a marriage arrangement, or you were assaulted and people blamed you for being too attractive, or you were involved in a scandal whether you wanted to be or not. The convent became a dumping ground for beautiful problems, a place to hide away women whose faces had caused too much disruption. The other nuns knew why you were there, and they resented it. They'd chosen this life, or at least they'd been sent for more acceptable reasons. You were here because your beauty made you too dangerous for the outside world. That wasn't a vocation. That was exile. And exile isn't a foundation for spiritual community. The abbess had particular problems with beautiful novices. Her job was maintaining order and discipline, and you were a disruption just by existing. She couldn't lock you away or make you invisible. You were part of the community, attending services, working alongside others, visible despite your veil. Your face was a constant reminder of worldly vanity, of the flesh, of everything the convent was supposed to transcend. So you got the worst jobs, the hardest labour, the least pleasant tasks, the assignments that would tire you out and hopefully make you less noticeable through sheer exhaustion. Scrubbing floors, hauling water, working in the gardens in all weather. The goal wasn't just productivity, it was mortification, making you suffer for the sin of being beautiful. The veil should have been an equalizer, right? Everyone covered everyone. Humble, all beauty hidden beneath identical habits. Except veils don't completely conceal faces, and even in identical clothing, exceptional beauty shows through. The curve of your cheek, the shape of your eyes, the way you move, these things remained visible, remained disruptive. Some abbesses tried to solve the problem through isolation. You'd be given a cell far from others, assigned to work alone, excluded from communal activities beyond mandatory services. It was like being in prison within a prison, cut off, even from the limited society the convent offered. Other nuns watched you with a mixture of resentment and fear. Fear that your beauty would attract attention to the convent itself from visiting priests, from noblemen who made donations, from anyone whose notice might disrupt their peaceful obscurity. Because even in a convent, male attention found beautiful women, and it caused chaos. The visiting priest who lingered too long when he blessed you. The bishop who made his inspections and seemed particularly interested in meeting the newest, prettiest novice. The nobleman who donated generously and specifically requested to see the young sisters at prayer. These attentions endangered the entire community, and it was always your fault for being too attractive, never their fault for being unable to control themselves. There are documented cases of priests and bishops sexually exploiting nuns, and beautiful nuns were especially vulnerable. The same power dynamics that made servants vulnerable to nobles made you vulnerable to clergy. They had spiritual authority over you, access to the convent, and the assumption of holiness that made accusations against them nearly impossible to prove. If something did happen, if you were assaulted by a visiting priest or drawn into an inappropriate relationship with a confessor, the blame fell entirely on you. You were Eve, the temptress, leading holy men astray with your devilish beauty. You'd be punished severely, possibly expelled from the convent entirely, while he would likely face no consequences beyond a quiet transfer. Historians still argue about how common sexual abuse in convents actually was, with some suggesting it's been exaggerated by anti-Catholic propaganda, and others pointing to substantial evidence of exploitation. But from your perspective, locked in a cell after Vespers, knowing the visiting bishop specifically asked to speak with you tomorrow, the historical debate is cold comfort. The other nuns' jealousy manifested in subtle cruelties. Your food portion slightly smaller, your work assignments slightly harder, your errors noticed and punished while others were overlooked. It was death by 1,000 small cuts, all justified under the guise of religious discipline. Some convents practiced extreme mortification of the flesh, fasting self-flagellation, wearing hair shirts. For beautiful nuns, these practices could be enforced more harshly, under the logic that your beauty was a spiritual obstacle, requiring more aggressive correction. Your face was a sin that needed to be beaten out of you. There's a documented case from 13th century Italy of a young nun named Chiara who was exceptionally beautiful. The abbess, convinced that Chiara's beauty was a form of spiritual pride, ordered her to sleep on stone without blankets, fast beyond the normal requirements, and spend hours in painful prayer positions. Chiara developed serious health problems before the bishop intervened, and even then she was simply transferred to another convent where the cycle began again. Prayer itself became complicated. You were supposed to focus on God, but your beauty meant others were focusing on you. During services, you could feel eyes on you, sometimes envious, sometimes lustful, always aware. Your presence disrupted contemplation, not because you did anything, but because you looked like something that reminded people of the world outside. Some beautiful nuns genuinely found peace in religious life, particularly if they ended up in strict enclosed orders with minimal outside contact. The walls that imprisoned them also protected them. No male attention, no marriage market, no constant harassment. For some, that trade-off was worth it. But for others, the convent was just another place where beauty was punished. You'd escaped one set of predators, only to find different ones. You'd sought sanctuary, only to discover that even God's house had no real safe space for a face like yours. The night prayers echo through stone corridors, and you kneel in your cell, genuinely praying for the first time in weeks. Not prayers of devotion, but prayers of exhaustion. You're asking God why he made you this way, why this face has been nothing but curse and burden, why even here in his house you can't find peace. The stone is cold beneath your knees, and no answer comes. Only tomorrow and the visiting bishop and whatever that will bring. The physician is examining you with the concerned expression of a man diagnosing a terminal illness. He's checking your humours, studying your complexion, nodding gravely. Finally, he delivers his verdict: you are dangerously beautiful, which means your bodily humours are severely imbalanced. This will likely kill you before 30. Congratulations. Medieval medicine was a fascinating blend of ancient Greek theory, religious belief, practical observation, and complete nonsense. And when it came to beauty, especially exceptional beauty, medical authorities had very specific and very alarming theories about what it meant for your health. The foundation was humoral theory inherited from Galen and Hippocrates. Your body contained 4 humours: blood phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health meant these were in balance. Disease meant imbalance. and extreme physical traits including exceptional beauty indicated extreme humoral states that were inherently unhealthy. According to medieval medical texts, if you were unusually beautiful with clear skin and bright eyes, you likely had an excess of blood, the hot, wet humour associated with youth, vigour and sexual desire. This sounds good until you realise medieval doctors believed excess blood led to fever madness and early death. Your beauty was literally a symptom of life-threatening imbalance, the prescription bloodletting, obviously. Beautiful young people, especially women, were bled regularly to reduce their excess sanguine humour. The theory was that removing blood would cool your system, reduce your dangerous vitality, and hopefully prevent the early death that your beauty predicted. Whether it actually helped is, shall we say, debatable. Some physicians believed exceptional beauty indicated an excess of heat in the body. You were too hot, too vital, burning too bright. This was seen as dangerous because excessive internal heat supposedly consumed the body from within like a candle burning too fast. Beautiful people were candles destined to gutter out early their brightness, a warning of imminent extinction. There are medical texts from the period explicitly warning that beautiful children often die young, their constitutions too delicate to sustain such perfection. Parents of beautiful children were advised to be vigilant for signs of fever consumption or sudden decline. Your looks became a medical prophecy of doom. The connection between beauty and sexuality was central to these theories. Medieval medicine viewed sexual desire as a potentially deadly force, especially in women. If you were beautiful, men desired you, which meant you were exposed to excessive sexual attention. This was believed to overheat your humours, leading to hysteria, melancholy, or full madness. Even if you remained chaste, the frustrated sexual energy, yours or others, was considered medically dangerous. Some texts suggest that beautiful virgins were at particular risk because their natural heat had no outlet and would turn inward, consuming them. The medical establishment literally believed your beauty combined with virginity could kill you. Female physicians and midwives sometimes had different views based more on practical observation than theory. But their voices were largely excluded from medical literature, so the humoral theories dominated. And those theories treated beauty as pathology. Historians still argue about how seriously medieval people took humoral theory versus using it as a convenient framework to justify existing biases. But physicians were trained in this system and treated patients based on it, and beautiful patients received specific interventions because of it. The complexion diagnostics were particularly invasive. Physicians would examine your skin tone, the colour of your lips, the brightness of your eyes, all the features that made you beautiful, and interpret them as signs of internal disorder. Rosy cheeks, dangerous excess of blood, bright eyes, fever waiting to happen, smooth skin, suspicious lack of the imperfections that indicated proper humoral balance. Some medical authorities believe that exceptional beauty in one generation predicted sickness in the next. If you were unusually attractive, your children would likely be weak, sickly or deformed because you'd used up all the family's vitality in your own perfect form. Your beauty literally robbed future generations of health. This created nightmare scenarios for beautiful women trying to marry. Yes, your looks attracted suitors initially, but medical theory suggested you'd produce unhealthy children. Some families actually rejected beautiful brides based on medical advice that their children would be compromised. Too much perfection in the mother meant imperfection in the offspring. The dietary restrictions imposed on beautiful people were severe. You were supposed to avoid heating foods, meat, wine, spices, because they would increase your already excessive heat. Instead, you should eat cooling foods like lettuce, cucumber, fish. This was believed to dampen your dangerous vitality and extend your predicted short lifespan. Some physicians recommended that beautiful women avoid sunlight, which was thought to increase bodily heat. You were supposed to stay indoors, remain cool and shadowed, basically live like a vampire to counteract your perilous constitution. This isolation was prescribed as medical necessity, not social control, but the effect was the same. Exercise was controversial. Some doctors thought beautiful people needed vigorous exercise to burn off excess heat and blood. Others believed exercise would overstimulate an already overheated system, bringing on early death. You couldn't win either way. Your beauty meant your body was a medical crisis waiting to happen. The intersection of medical theory and religious belief created particularly dark conclusions. Some theologians argue that exceptional beauty was a test from God, a burden you'd been given to overcome. But medical texts suggested it was a curse you'd inherited, possibly punishment for ancestral sin manifesting in your dangerous good looks. There's a chilling consistency across medieval medical literature. Beauty in women is almost always discussed as a problem requiring intervention. Male beauty gets different treatment, often seen as a sign of noble blood or divine favour. But female beauty, that's a disease waiting to kill you, corrupt others, or both. The treatments could be genuinely harmful. Repeated bloodletting weakened patients sometimes fatally. Strict dietary restrictions led to malnutrition. Isolation contributed to depression and genuine illness. The medical establishment was literally making beautiful people sick, while claiming to treat the sickness their beauty represented. Some women internalized these theories, completely believing their looks were signs of impending doom. There are letters and diaries from medieval women expressing fear that their beauty meant they'd die young, that they were burning too bright to last. The medical establishment had convinced them their faces were symptoms of terminal illness. And when beautiful people did die young from disease, childbirth, complications, violence, or any of the 1,000 things that killed medieval people, it was taken as proof that the medical theories were correct. See, exceptional beauty does lead to early death. The fact that everyone faced high mortality rates was conveniently overlooked. You leave the physician's chamber with instructions to return monthly for bloodletting, to avoid meat and wine, to stay out of sunlight, and to prepare yourself spiritually for a short life. Your beauty, he's explained kindly, is the fever that will consume you. You pay him for this diagnosis, pay him for telling you that your face is a medical death sentence. You walk home in the afternoon sun, wondering if each ray is hastening your predicted doom, and thinking that maybe ugliness would have been the healthier option after all. You've just received your 3rd compliment today, and your stomach is churning with dread. The baker called you lovely as morning. The merchant's son said you had the face of an angel. The priest himself remarked on your pleasing countenance. By nightfall, half the village will know. By tomorrow, the stories will have multiplied. By next week, you'll be known as the girl who encourages men's attention. And you said nothing. You just existed. Welcome to the paradox of medieval beauty. Being noticed is dangerous. But being noticed isn't something you can control. Every compliment is a stone added to the pile that will eventually crush you. Every admiring glance is evidence in a trial you don't know you're facing yet. And there's absolutely nothing you can do to stop it. The medieval world was built on reputation. Your reputation determined your marriage prospects, your employment opportunities, your social standing, your literal survival. And reputation was determined by what people said about you, not by what you actually did. For beautiful women, the things people said multiplied and mutated like plague, spreading through cramped quarters. Let's trace how it works. The baker compliments you in the morning. By noon his wife has heard. She mentions to the butcher's wife that her husband seems quite taken with that girl. The butcher's wife tells the miller's wife that the baker's been paying special attention to someone. The miller's wife tells her daughter that there's a girl in the village who's been turning men's heads. By evening, the story has grown arms and legs and teeth. By the next day, you're not just receiving compliments, you're encouraging them. You're flaunting yourself, you're deliberately tempting married men. None of this is true. You've done nothing but walk to the well and buy bread. But the narrative has escaped your control entirely, and it's running through the village like a feral dog, getting bigger and meaner with every retelling. The third day someone mentions you smiled at the merchant's son. You didn't. You were polite because he's a customer and you're not suicidal. But the smile is now evidence. Evidence of what? Of your loose morals, obviously. Of your willingness to engage in improper behaviour. Good girls don't smile at men. Good girls keep their eyes down and their faces neutral, and somehow manage to navigate social interactions without any facial expressions whatsoever. By the fourth day, the priest's comment about your pleasing countenance has become, the priest has noticed you, which has become, you've been catching the priest's eye, which has become, you're attempting to seduce the priest. The direction of attention has been completely reversed. He noticed you, but you're accused of making yourself noticeable. He spoke to you, but you're guilty of provoking speech. This is the medieval version of going viral, except instead of likes and shares, you're accumulating accusations and suspicion. And unlike modern social media, where you might be able to delete your account and disappear, you're stuck in this village with these people and this growing reputation that's completely divorced from anything you've actually done. The really insidious part is how the gossip network operates. It's primarily women spreading these stories not because women are naturally catty or whatever misogynistic explanation you might expect, but because women's social power existed largely in the realm of reputation management. They controlled who was acceptable and who wasn't through strategic gossip. And they had legitimate grievances, didn't they? Your beauty did attract their husband's attention. Their marriages were already strained by medieval life's brutality, and now here you are, young and pretty, making their husbands look your way. They can't control their husbands, but they can control the narrative about you. So they do. The men, meanwhile, bear no responsibility. The baker who complimented you, he's just being friendly, appreciating God's creation, no harm meant. The merchant's son, boys will be boys. The priest, he's a holy man. Obviously, any impropriety must be your doing. The direction of desire, the initiation of attention, none of it matters. What matters is that you're beautiful, and therefore guilty. Historians still argue about how much power women actually wielded through gossip networks, versus how much we're imposing modern ideas about female social dynamics onto medieval communities. But the sources are pretty clear. Reputation could be destroyed through strategic whisper campaigns, and beautiful women were frequent targets. The accusations don't even need to be specific, you're just talked about. Your name comes up in conversations with raised eyebrows and knowing looks. Have you seen the way she... followed by meaningful silence. I've heard things about... with no details provided. The vagueness makes it impossible to defend yourself because you're not even sure what you're being accused of. Some girls tried to preemptively manage their reputations through extreme modesty. Eyes permanently downcast, face always covered, speaking only when absolutely necessary, avoiding any situation where they might be alone with men or even visible to men. But this strategy had limited success because your beauty was the problem, not your behaviour. You could be a silent covered shadow and still attract attention you didn't want and gossip you couldn't control. The market was the worst place for reputation destruction. Everyone gathered there, all the village's social dynamics concentrated in one public space. Every interaction was observed and interpreted. If you spent too long at one stall, you were flirting. If you laughed at something, someone said you were encouraging them. If you wore something nice, you were displaying yourself inappropriately. Even trying to minimize interaction didn't help. If you rushed through the market quickly without speaking to anyone, you were proud, thinking yourself too good for normal social courtesy. If you were friendly and polite, you were forward and immodest. There was literally no correct way to navigate public space when your face made every action suspicious. The church steps after Mass were another gossip hotspot. Women would gather and talk while men conducted business, and reputations were made and unmade in these conversations. You could actually watch your social standing crumble in real time if you paid attention to who was talking and who was avoiding eye contact with you. Some communities had official defamation laws. You could theoretically sue someone for spreading false rumours that damaged your reputation. But these laws were nearly useless for beautiful women, because the rumours were never quite false enough to prosecute. I've heard she's been seen talking to men. Well, you have been seen talking to men. The implication that this is improper isn't technically a lie, just an interpretation. And bringing a defamation suit required resources, social standing, and male relatives willing to support you publicly. If you were poor young, or your family was tired of your beauty causing problems, you had no access to legal remedy. You just had to endure the slow assassination of your reputation. The cumulative effect was like being buried alive in words. Each compliment, each glance, each innocent interaction added another layer of earth on top of you until you couldn't breathe. Your beauty had made you the main character in a story you didn't write, don't control, and can't escape. Everyone's talking about you, which in medieval terms might as well be everyone's killing you slowly. Some women broke under this pressure. There are records of young women developing what we'd now call severe anxiety or depression, refusing to leave their homes, unable to eat, wasting away under the weight of social scrutiny. The medical establishment would diagnose humoral imbalance and recommend bloodletting, missing entirely that the real illness was living under constant hostile observation. Others hardened themselves, developing thick psychological armour against the gossip. If everyone's going to call you immodest anyway, why bother being modest? If your reputation's destroyed regardless of your behaviour, why not at least enjoy some of the things you're being accused of? This response sometimes led to genuinely rebellious behaviour, which of course confirmed everyone's worst suspicions and justified the gossip retroactively. You lie in bed tonight replaying each interaction from the day, trying to figure out what you did wrong. You can't identify a mistake because you didn't make one. You were just visible. You were just beautiful in public. And somehow that's transformed into a dozen different stories about your moral failings spreading through the village like smoke from a fire you didn't light and can't extinguish. Tomorrow you'll wake up and do it again. Exist, be seen, be talked about, be destroyed, one compliment at a time. The king's court has arrived in the region and your lord has been invited to attend. He's bringing his household, which means you're going to a serving girl, part of the background supposedly invisible. Except you're not invisible. You've never been invisible. And now you're entering the most dangerous room in the entire kingdom, a place where powerful men have everything they want except limits on their behaviour. Royal courts in medieval Europe were glittering cultured centres of art and politics. They were also hunting grounds where beautiful young women were prey, and the hunters were men who could literally have you killed if you inconvenienced them. Welcome to the apex of danger, where your beauty intersects with unchecked power. The court operates on entirely different rules than normal society. Back in your village, there were at least some constraints. Community opinion, family protection, the priest's theoretical moral authority. Here those constraints dissolve. The men at court are nobles, often far from their own lands, surrounded by other nobles who share their sense of entitlement. They're bored, they're competitive with each other, and they view beautiful servants as entertainment. You're standing in the great hall, serving wine, trying to be invisible, but the Duke's eyes have found you. He's watching you move, and you can feel his attention like heat on your skin. This isn't the awkward attention of village boys or even the entitled attention of your own lord. This is predatory calculation. He's deciding whether he wants you, and if he decides yes, there's very little that will stop him from taking you. The social dynamics at court are brutally simple. Power determines everything. The king is at the top, then high nobles, then lesser nobles, then knights, then everyone else. You're somewhere near the bottom of that hierarchy, which means you have no power at all. None. Your lord might theoretically protect you, but only if protecting you doesn't offend someone more important than him. And most people here are more important. The Duke sends a servant to fetch you. Your hands are shaking as you approach, and you're trying to remember every strategy you've ever heard for handling unwanted noble attention. Be respectful, but not encouraging. Keep your eyes down. Answer briefly. Don't smile. Don't frown, that's disrespectful. Don't show fear that's exciting to them. Just be neutral, invisible, unmemorable. Except your face makes unmemorable impossible. He wants you to serve at his table tonight. Just serving, he sees nothing more. You have no choice but to agree. Your lord nods permission, what else can he do? This is a duke, for God's sake. Refusing would be a deadly insult. So you're handed over like a cup being passed between diners, and you spend the evening pouring wine for a table of drunk nobles who treat you like a fascinating toy. The conversation around you is appalling. They're discussing you as if you can't hear them, rating your features, debating your origins, making increasingly explicit comments about what they'd like to do with you. You keep your face blank, your hands steady, and you pray this is as bad as it gets. It's not. After dinner, the Duke asks you to stay, to attend him in his chambers, he says, to help him with his clothing, his comfort. The euphemisms are thin as silk, and everyone knows what he's really asking. Your lord is right there. He says nothing. The other nobles smile knowingly. This is entertainment for them, a show where you're the unwilling performer. You could refuse. Theoretically. You could say no and face the consequences, dismissal from your position, possibly accusation of insubordination, or theft, maybe worse. Or you could go and face different consequences, being used, and probably discarded, possibly pregnant, definitely ruined. These are your options. The Duke is waiting for your answer, and the entire table is watching. Historians still argue about how common sexual exploitation was at medieval courts, versus how much of our understanding comes from sensationalized accounts. But the power dynamics were undeniably skewed, and beautiful servants were undeniably vulnerable. The sources that survive letters, court records, the occasional memoir suggest exploitation was common enough to be unremarkable. Some girls at court became official mistresses, which was actually one of the better outcomes. A recognised mistress had some status, some protection, some rewards. She was still property, still disposable, but at least she was valuable property for a while. The alternative was being used and forgotten, or worse, being used and then disposed of violently to hide the evidence. The Queen and other noble women at court were not your allies. They resented beautiful servants for the same reasons village wives did, but with more power to act on that resentment. A queen who noticed her husband's attention straying might have you removed from court, beaten, married off to someone horrible, or simply disappeared. Their power was limited, so they exercised it ruthlessly over the women they could control. Court politics meant that beautiful servants could become pawns in larger games. One faction might use you to compromise a rival, send you to seduce someone, then expose the scandal. You had no say in these schemes, but you'd bear all the consequences if caught. Your beauty made you a useful weapon that other people wielded against each other. The temporary nature of court gatherings made things worse. Many nobles were only at court briefly, then returning to distant lands. This meant they had little incentive to worry about consequences. Use a servant leave, never see her again. No ongoing responsibility. No local reputation damage, no accountability whatsoever. Some courts had reputations as particularly dangerous. Everyone knew which kings or princes treated servants as disposable pleasures. But this knowledge didn't protect you. If your lord had business at that court, you went anyway. Your safety was less important than his political or economic interests. The entertainment at court sometimes included the servants themselves. Beautiful girls might be displayed, paraded, even asked to perform or dance for the amusement of guests. This wasn't explicitly sexual, but the undertone was clear. You were there to be looked at, evaluated, desired. And what was desired at court was generally taken. There are scattered accounts of resistance servants who fought back, who escaped, who found protectors. But these stories are rare, which tells you something about how often resistance succeeded. The power imbalance was simply too extreme. A beautiful peasant girl versus a duke. That's not a fight. It's a foregone conclusion. Some girls who survived court life came away traumatized, but materially better off with gifts, money connections. Others came away pregnant, diseased, or psychologically shattered. Many didn't come away at all, dying from botched abortion, suicide, or violence. Your beauty had gotten you noticed at the highest levels of society, and those heights were lethal. The worst part was that this could happen at any time. Courts travelled, nobles visited, royal progresses moved through regions. You could be living relatively safely in your village, then suddenly your lord hosts an important guest, and you're thrust into proximity with men for whom your consent is literally not a consideration in their decision-making process. You're back in your corner of the servants' quarters tonight, shaking, trying not to cry loud enough to be heard. You escaped this time, the Duke got distracted by other entertainment, or maybe your lord quietly paid someone to redirect his attention. But you know it's temporary. There will be other courts, other nobles, other nights when powerful men decide they want to possess the pretty thing they have noticed. Your beauty opened doors to rooms you never wanted to enter, and those doors don't lock from the inside. The magistrate is looking at you with barely concealed contempt. You're standing in the town square and he's just asked you a simple question. What's your profession? You say you're a seamstress. He doesn't believe you, because seamstresses, in his experience, don't look like you. Beautiful women who aren't attached to wealthy men are by definition prostitutes. And now he's going to make that official. Medieval Europe had complex legalistic systems for regulating sex work, and if you were beautiful and poor and unattached, you were perpetually at risk of being forced into those systems whether you worked as a prostitute or not. Your looks were evidence. Your poverty was evidence. Your lack of a husband was evidence. Guilty until proven innocent, except you couldn't prove innocence when your face was the crime. Let's be clear about medieval prostitution first. It was ubiquitous, often legal or semi-legal, and heavily regulated. Cities had designated areas, licensing systems, periodic health inspections, and strict rules about identification. Prostitutes were required to wear specific clothing, different coloured hoods, stripes, bells, badges, anything that marked them as sexually available and morally distinct from respectable women. The stated purpose of these identification requirements was protecting virtuous women from being mistaken for prostitutes. The actual effect was giving authorities a tool to force any beautiful poor woman into the sex trade by simply declaring her one. If you looked like a prostitute, which apparently meant being attractive, you could be required to register as one. The process was Kafkaesque. Maybe you're walking through town and a bailiff stops you. Why are you dressed nicely? Where did you get that cloak? Who's supporting you? Your answers don't matter because he's already decided what you're based on your face. You're brought before a magistrate who looks at you and sees exactly what he expects to see. A beautiful woman, therefore a prostitute. You protest. You have a trade, you're a seamstress, a laundress, a baker's assistant. They ask for your employer. If you work independently, that's suspicious. Why isn't a husband or father managing your work? If you name an employer, they'll investigate. And if your employer happens to be male, that's even more suspicious. You're claiming to work for a man doing what exactly? The insinuation hangs in the air like smoke. Some cities required unmarried women to either live with family work in verifiable household service or register as prostitutes. If you were beautiful and none of those categories applied, maybe you were orphaned or your family had died, or you'd escaped an abusive situation, you had limited options. Register as a sex worker or face arrest for vagrancy. The registration itself was humiliating. You'd be examined, often physically, to verify you were suitable for the work. The authorities needed to ensure you weren't diseased too old or too young. Prostitution was regulated after all, and they had standards. Never mind that you weren't actually a prostitute. Once registered, you were one legally, and the work would follow. Historians still argue about how many women were forced into prostitution versus how many chose it as a survival strategy in a world with limited options. But the sources show clear patterns of beautiful women being registered against their will, their looks used as evidence of existing sex work even when none had occurred. Once registered, you had to follow the rules. Wear the identifying markers in some cities, a yellow hood or cloak, in others striped sleeves or special badges. You were restricted to certain streets, forbidden from churches, except at specific times, barred from respectable areas. Your movement through the city became criminalized. You could be arrested just for being in the wrong neighborhood while beautiful and marked. The clothing requirements were designed to humiliate and isolate. The colors were often deliberately ugly or garish. The styles were meant to be immediately recognizable and vaguely shameful. You were being branded, marked as morally contaminated, visually segregated from decent society. And all because someone decided your face indicated your profession. The prostitutes' quarter, whatever it was called in your city, became your prison. You were required to live there or at least conduct business there. These areas were often near the city walls, by the docks, in the poorest sections. They were dangerous, crime-ridden, and offered no real protection. You were supposedly regulated by the city, but the regulation was all restriction, no safety. Some cities had municipal brothels officially sanctioned and managed. If you were registered as a prostitute, you might be required to work in one. The brothel keeper, often a woman interestingly, took a large percentage of earnings, and you had little say in clients or conditions. You were trapped in an official system of exploitation, all because someone looked at your face and decided what you must be. The clients were often the same men who'd registered you in the first place. Magistrates, bailiffs, wealthy merchants, the very people who'd branded you a prostitute, now felt entitled to use your services. The hypocrisy was staggering, but completely normalized. They maintained public morality by identifying and containing prostitutes, then privately enjoyed the fruits of that system. Some beautiful women tried to avoid registration by getting married quickly, even to unsuitable men. But this had its own risks. A hasty marriage to a man you barely knew might be worse than registered prostitution. At least as a registered prostitute, you kept some of your earnings. A husband owned everything, including you. The really dark detail is that once registered, escape was nearly impossible. Even if you later married, your history followed you. You'd been legally identified as a prostitute, recorded in city books, marked in public memory. That stain didn't wash out. Your future children would know. Your neighbors would know. Everyone would always know. Some cities allowed retirement from prostitution under certain conditions, reaching a certain age, demonstrating changed behavior, finding a husband willing to overlook your past. But beautiful women had trouble meeting these conditions because their looks continued to mark them as suspicious. You couldn't age out of beauty fast enough, and finding a husband was difficult when everyone knew your registered history. Disease was inevitable. Medieval cities had no concept of germ theory, no antibiotics, no real treatment for sexually transmitted infections. If you were forced into sex work, you'd likely contract something eventually, and when you did, the city would expel you from the prostitutes' quarter, turning you out to die because diseased prostitutes were bad for business. The Christian Church had complex views on prostitution. Augustine had argued it was a necessary evil, preventing worse sins by providing an outlet for male lust. So prostitution was simultaneously condemned and tolerated, the prostitutes themselves seen as both sinful and serving a social function. You were damned for doing exactly what society required you to do. Some prostitutes became quite wealthy, and even respected in their communities, the famous courtesans of Venice, for instance. But they were exceptional cases, usually involving beauty combined with intelligence, talent, and extraordinary luck. For most women forced into sex work, the outcome was poverty, disease, and early death. There are scattered accounts of women who successfully fought registration, usually by having powerful male relatives intervene. A father or brother could testify to your virtue, threaten legal action, make enough trouble that authorities backed down. But if you were alone, or if your family had abandoned you, or if they were too poor or powerless to fight, you had no recourse. You sit in your marked yellow cloak tonight, in your assigned corner of the prostitutes' quarter, and you remember the seamstress you were last week. You had to trade a small room, a life that was hard but yours. Now you're this officially and legally because your face convinced a magistrate you must already be selling yourself. They've made their assumption into reality, and tomorrow the first clients will come and you'll discover that being beautiful in medieval times could quite literally force you into the one profession that guarantees your beauty won't last long anyway. Your mother is holding the hot iron near your cheek, and she's crying harder than you are. She doesn't want to do this, but the alternative is worse. The nobleman's son has been circling the house for weeks, and last night he tried to break down the door. Your father is dead, you have no brothers, and your face is a death sentence. So your mother, with shaking hands, is about to burn a scar across your cheek to save your life. This is the darkest calculation medieval families sometimes made deliberate disfigurement as protection. If you can't hide beauty, destroy it. If you can't make yourself invisible, make yourself unmarketable. It's horrifying, it's tragic, and it happened often enough that scattered references appear throughout medieval records. Girls who were accidentally burned or cut, always conveniently on visible areas, always just enough to mar without completely destroying. The decision was never made lightly. Your face was your fortune, even if that fortune came with deadly complications. A beautiful daughter could marry up, improve the family's standing, secure connections. Destroying that beauty meant accepting a lower social ceiling, worse marriage prospects, probable poverty. Families only made this choice when the dangers of beauty outweighed its potential benefits. What made beauty more dangerous than valuable isolation usually? If you were in a powerful family with male relatives who could protect you, beauty was an asset they could leverage strategically. But if you were poor orphaned or your male protectors were weak or dead, beauty became a target painted on your face. The nobleman's son who wanted you didn't need to negotiate with anyone, he could just take you. Unless you were no longer worth taking. The disfigurement had to be careful. Too little, and you'd still be attractive enough to draw dangerous attention. Too much, and you'd be so unmarketable that you'd never marry at all, becoming a permanent burden on your family or ending up destitute. The goal was to drop you from dangerously beautiful to acceptably plain enough to deflect predators without making you completely unmarriageable. Scars on the face were most effective. A burn across the cheek, a cut along the jaw, something visible that would heal into permanent disfigurement. These couldn't be hidden by clothing or covered by hair. They announced to everyone who saw you that you were no longer the beautiful girl you'd been. The social currency had been deliberately devalued. Some families blamed accidents. The girl was working near the fire and sparks flew. She was helping in the kitchen when a pot tipped. She fell and struck her face on stone. These stories were paper thin and everyone knew what had really happened, but they provided social cover. The family could maintain that it was tragedy, not strategy, even though everyone understood it was protection. There are heartbreaking references in medieval sources to girls who participated in their own disfigurement, understanding that their faces were going to get them killed and choosing scars over death. A 14th century letter describes a young woman who deliberately pressed her face to a hot stone, burning her cheek badly enough to scar after a local lord's interest became threatening. She lived. she eventually married a farmer. The alternative was likely rape pregnancy and murder to hide the Lord's crime. Historians still argue about how common deliberate disfigurement actually was. The references are scattered and often ambiguous, hard to distinguish genuine accidents from strategic ones. But the logic was sound, and medieval people were nothing if not grimly practical about survival. If destroying your daughter's face saved her life, you destroyed her face. The psychological impact was devastating. Imagine being a child, maybe 10 or 12, and having your mother or father explain that they need to hurt you to protect you, that your face is so dangerous that it needs to be ruined, that your beauty, the thing people have complimented your entire short life, is actually a threat that must be eliminated. How do you process that? Some girls who were disfigured this way reportedly struggled with the aftermath, not just the physical pain and permanent scarring, but the psychological weight of knowing your own family found you so dangerous they had to damage you. Even if you understood intellectually that it was protection, emotionally it felt like punishment for being born wrong. The community's reaction varied. Some people understood and quietly approved, yes, that family made the hard but necessary choice. Others whispered that it was barbaric, that the family had destroyed their own asset, that surely there were other solutions. But those critics rarely offered concrete alternatives beyond vague suggestions about better supervision or more modest behaviour, which were useless against determined predators. Some disfigurement was done by the girls themselves, acting alone when they saw no other option. There's a record from 13th century Germany of a young novice nun who reportedly cut her own face repeatedly with a knife to discourage a nobleman who kept visiting the convent demanding to marry her. The cuts became infected, she nearly died, but he lost interest and left her alone. The scars saved her life and her vows. Other communities had different strategies. Some families married off beautiful daughters, extremely young, 12, 13, as soon as legally possible to get them under a husband's protection before they attracted too much dangerous attention. This wasn't ideal, but it was safer than remaining unmarried and vulnerable in a world of predators. Convents were another solution we've discussed, but they cost money and weren't guaranteed safety. Disfigurement was cheaper and more certain. A scarred face discouraged noble interest, discouraged kidnapping attempts, discouraged most of the specific dangers beauty attracted while still leaving you capable of normal life and work. The irony was that moderate disfigurement sometimes made women's lives easier. They were still attractive enough to marry within their class, but no longer beautiful enough to attract attention from above their station. They dropped out of the danger zone into relative safety. Their scars were literally protective armour. But severe disfigurement was its own catastrophe. If the burn or cut was too deep, too visible, too disturbing to look at, you'd become unmarriageable and unemployable. You'd gone from too beautiful to too ugly, and both extremes were dangerous in medieval society. The middle ground was narrow, and aiming for it with a hot iron or a knife was terrifying precision work. Some religious authorities condemned deliberate disfigurement as sinful. You were destroying God's creation, showing pride by assuming you knew better than divine providence. But other clergy quietly understood and even advised it when the alternative was certain ruin. The theological debate was complex, but in practical terms, survival often trumped religious concerns. There's a documented case from 15th century Italy of a family that disfigured all three of their daughters preemptively. The girls were all growing up beautiful in a region where local nobility had a reputation for abducting peasant girls. Rather than wait for the inevitable, the father scarred all three daughters' faces when they were young. All three survived to adulthood. Married local men lived unremarkable lives. Without the scars, the family believed none would have survived their teenage years. The practice occasionally appeared in literature, usually as tragedy or cautionary tale. Stories of beautiful maidens who scarred themselves to preserve their virtue, which was supposed to be inspiring but mostly just highlighted how few good options existed. If self-mutilation was your best choice, the system had failed catastrophically. Modern historians sometimes frame these acts as expressions of agency, women or families making strategic choices to navigate impossible situations, and there's truth in that. But it's agency within such constrained options that calling it empowering feels obscene. This wasn't freedom. This was cutting off your own foot to escape a trap. Your mother has finally pressed the iron to your cheek, and the pain is extraordinary, and you're screaming and she's screaming too, and your entire face feels like it's being consumed by fire. When it's over, and the wound is dressed and you're lying in your bed crying, you touch the bandage gently. Under there is your future a permanent scar that will mark you as damaged, unmarketable to nobility, safe enough to survive. Your mother ruined your face to save your life, and you'll carry that contradiction in the mirror or in your bucket of water, since mirrors are expensive for the rest of your days. The old woman at the market crosses herself when you walk past, then spits 3 times over her left shoulder. Yesterday a child started crying when you smiled at her, and the mother snatched the baby away, muttering protective charms. Last week the blacksmith's horse went lame the day after you'd stopped to admire it. Everyone knows it was you. Your beauty has cursed them with the evil eye and they're terrified. Welcome to one of the most pervasive superstitions in medieval Europe, the belief that exceptional beauty could literally emanate harmful power, cursing those who looked upon it, or were looked upon by it. The evil eye wasn't just metaphor or moral judgment. People genuinely believed your face could cause physical harm through supernatural means. The concept of the evil eye predated Christianity by millennia, rooted in ancient Mediterranean and Middle Eastern beliefs that certain people could project harmful energy through their gaze. Medieval Europe inherited these ideas and wrapped them in Christian supernatural frameworks. Now, your beautiful eyes weren't just aesthetically striking, they were potentially cursed conduits of malevolent force. The logic went like this: beauty attracts attention and admiration. Admiration is a form of desire. Desire is inherently corrupting and destabilizing. Therefore, exceptional beauty emanates a kind of spiritual pollution that can harm innocent bystanders. Your face wasn't just pretty. It was radiating invisible corruption that could curdle, milk, kill livestock, sicken children, and cause crops to fail. You didn't need to intend harm. That's what made this belief so dangerous for beautiful people. The evil eye wasn't about malice. It was about the inherent power of striking features to disrupt the natural order. You could be the kindest person in the village, and your face would still be blamed when inexplicable misfortune occurred. The signs of evil eye were conveniently vague and universally applicable. Did someone's cow die within a month of seeing you evil eye? Did a child develop fever after you held them? Your curse at work? Did someone's bread fail to rise, or their ale go sour, or their husband suddenly take ill? If you'd been in the vicinity recently, you'd be suspected. Rural communities were particularly susceptible to this belief because they lived in intimate daily contact with agricultural cycles, livestock health, and weather patterns, all things that failed regularly for completely natural reasons but which needed explanation. A beautiful stranger or even a beautiful local provided that explanation. When things went wrong, your face gave the community someone to blame. The protective measures people took against the evil eye were sometimes elaborate. The old woman who crossed herself and spat. That's standard anti-curse behaviour. Others would touch iron or make specific hand gestures, horns, figs, whatever their regional tradition prescribed. Some people wore amulets specifically to ward off the evil eye, and they'd grip those amulets when you approached. Children were considered especially vulnerable to the evil eye, which created a nightmare situation for beautiful women around babies and young children. If you complimented someone's baby, which was just polite social behaviour, you'd be accused of cursing the child through envious admiration. If you didn't compliment the baby, you were cold and strange. You couldn't win. Some mothers wouldn't allow beautiful women near their infants at all. You'd be physically blocked from approaching refused entry to homes during naming ceremonies, or baptisms excluded from communal child-rearing activities. Your beauty had transformed you into a biohazard that needed to be quarantined away from the vulnerable. Historians still argue about how literally medieval people believed in the evil eye versus using it as a convenient cultural explanation for misfortune. But the behavioural evidence is clear. People took active measures to protect themselves from beautiful people's gazes, and beautiful people were blamed for a remarkable range of calamities. The evil eye belief was particularly strong in Mediterranean and Southern European cultures, but it existed throughout the continent in various forms. In some regions it was called overlooking, in others fascination. The terminology varied, but the core idea remained: your striking features could harm others without you even trying. This belief intersected dangerously with witchcraft accusations. If you were beautiful, and also suspected of having the evil eye, you were basically already halfway to being accused of witchcraft. The evil eye was evidence of supernatural power, and supernatural power in a woman was obviously demonic. The progression from "she has the evil eye" to "she's a witch" was disturbingly short. Some beautiful women tried to counteract evil eye accusations through ostentatious piety. Constant church attendance, loud public prayers, donations to the poor, anything to demonstrate that you were God-fearing and couldn't possibly be emanating harmful supernatural power. This strategy had limited success because people who wanted to believe you were cursed would interpret even your piety as suspicious. The really perverse aspect was that the more you tried to avoid looking at people keeping your eyes down, avoiding eye contact, the more suspicious you seemed. Why won't she look at us? What's she hiding? Is she afraid her evil gaze will be exposed? Your attempts at modesty and self-protection were reinterpreted as evidence of conscious guilt. In some communities, beautiful people were required to look at protective amulets or symbols before interacting with others. There were beliefs that certain patterns or religious images could absorb or neutralize the evil eye's power. You'd essentially be required to stare at a cross or a particular saint's image before being allowed to approach, like discharging static electricity before touching sensitive equipment. Livestock deaths were particularly dangerous accusation triggers. A farmer's livelihood depended on his animals. If his best milk cow suddenly died and he remembered that you'd walked past his barn the previous day, you had a serious problem. He needed someone to blame for his economic catastrophe, and your beautiful face made you the perfect scapegoat. The harvest season was especially tense. Entire communities depended on successful harvests, and countless things could go wrong. Weather pests, disease, bad luck. If the crops failed and you were beautiful and noticeably different, you might find yourself blamed for supernatural interference. Your face had somehow blighted the wheat, spoiled the grain, cursed the fields. Some regions had folk remedies for removing the evil eye's effects. Priests might perform blessings, wise women might create counter-charms, families might conduct protective rituals. But these remedies reinforced the belief that you were dangerous. The existence of cures proved the threat was real, and you were that threat. There are documented cases of beautiful women being attacked or driven from communities specifically because of evil eye beliefs. A woman in 14th century Provence was reportedly beaten and expelled from her village after several children died during a fever outbreak. She'd done nothing except exist and be beautiful during a time of crisis, but that was enough. The community needed to expel the perceived source of curse to feel safe again. The economic impact on beautiful women was significant. If people believed you had the evil eye, they wouldn't hire, you wouldn't buy from you, wouldn't do business with you. Your beauty had made you economically radioactive. You might have valuable skills, but nobody wanted your cursed presence near their livelihood. Travelling was particularly dangerous because you'd encounter new communities that didn't know you. Strangers were already suspect, and beautiful strangers were doubly so. You might arrive in a village and immediately be viewed as a potential evil eye carrier. Some communities would try to prevent beautiful strangers from staying, fearing the supernatural contamination they might bring. The belief persisted because it was unfalsifiable. If nothing bad happened after someone encountered you, it meant their protective measures worked or they'd been lucky. If something bad did happen, it proved you had the evil eye. There was no way to demonstrate your innocence because absence of evidence wasn't evidence of absence in medieval supernatural thinking. Some beautiful people internalized these beliefs, genuinely worrying that maybe they were cursed, maybe their face did carry harmful power. Living under constant accusation could make you doubt your own innocence. Maybe you were dangerous without knowing it. Maybe your beauty was a curse you carried, unknowingly harming everyone around you, through no fault of your own. You're lying in bed tonight, and you can hear the neighbours through the thin walls praying for protection. Protection from you. You've done nothing wrong, harmed no one, wished ill on nobody. But the blacksmith's horse is lame, and the baker's daughter has a fever, and the last harvest was poor, and somehow all of that is your fault. Your face has marked you as a supernatural threat, and there's no way to prove you're not carrying the curse everyone believes you carry. You close your eyes, those beautiful cursed eyes, and pray that tomorrow brings no misfortune anywhere near you, because you'll be blamed regardless. You're 8 years old playing by the river with other children when the men grab you. They're not from your village. They speak a different dialect. One of them is holding a list and he's checked something off. You're screaming for your mother, but she's too far away to hear. And by the time anyone realizes you're gone, you'll be 20 miles away, headed toward a fate that your beauty has sealed. Welcome to the horrifying reality of medieval child abduction, where beautiful children, especially girls, but sometimes boys too, were valuable commodities in a thriving underground economy. Your exceptional looks made you a target for kidnappers who knew exactly where to sell pretty children and approximately how much they'd fetch. The medieval world had limited law enforcement, vast forests and roads between settlements, and a brisk trade in human beings. Children were particularly vulnerable because they were small, easy to overpower, and once taken far from home, nearly impossible to trace back to their families. If you were beautiful, you were worth stealing. The kidnappers operated in organised networks. They'd scout villages, markets and pilgrim routes looking for particularly attractive children. They'd note which families seemed poor or distracted, which children played without supervision, which communities had weak defences. Then they'd strike quickly, efficiently, often in broad daylight, because who's going to stop a man carrying a crying child when he claims it's his daughter having a tantrum? Where did kidnapped beautiful children end up? The answers are uniformly terrible. Some were sold into household service in distant cities where no one knew their origins. Masters preferred attractive servants, and a beautiful child, stolen young, could be trained into perfect obedience with no family to appeal to if things went wrong. Others ended up in brothels being groomed from childhood for sex work. Medieval prostitution included children, a horrifying reality that sources document, but which authorities rarely prosecuted effectively. Beautiful children were valuable investments that would become profitable once they reached puberty. The younger they were acquired, the more thoroughly they could be broken and trained. Some beautiful children were sold into forced marriages, essentially human trafficking dressed as matrimony. A wealthy man without heirs might purchase a beautiful child bride, or a family seeking to improve their bloodline might buy an attractive child to raise and eventually marry to their son. These arrangements were legally questionable but socially tolerated if the buyer had enough money and status. The Mediterranean slave trade absorbed some kidnapped children. Though slavery had declined in northern Europe by the High Middle Ages, it persisted in southern regions and the Islamic world. Beautiful children commanded premium prices, especially if they were light-skinned, and could be trained in household skills or entertainment. Historians still argue about the scale of child abduction in medieval Europe. Records are fragmentary, and most kidnappings went unreported or unresolved. But the sources that survive suggest it was common enough that parents in vulnerable communities lived in constant fear, and beautiful children were warned repeatedly about strangers. The lack of photographs or detailed physical descriptions made recovery nearly impossible. If your child was taken, how would you find them? You could report it to local authorities who might or might not investigate. You could search nearby towns yourself if you had the resources and time, which poor peasants typically didn't. You could pray and hope, but realistically, once a child disappeared, they were usually gone forever. Some families tried to hide their beautiful children. Keep them indoors, don't let them go to market, don't let them play in visible areas. But this strategy had its own costs, socially isolating children, preventing normal development, creating suspicious behaviour that itself attracted attention, and you couldn't hide them forever. Eventually they'd need to work to marry to exist in public spaces where predators could see them. The warning stories parents told were often based on real incidents. Every region had tales of the beautiful child who vanished, who was last seen talking to a stranger who disappeared during a festival or while fetching water. These stories served as cautionary tales, teaching children to be wary. But they also revealed how common the threat was. If every community had these stories, the problem was endemic. Boys weren't immune, though girls were more frequently targeted. Beautiful boys could be sold into service, apprenticed under false pretenses to masters who wanted attractive servants, or trafficked for sexual exploitation. The medieval world had markets for all types of beauty, and none of them were safe for children. Some kidnappers posed as legitimate recruiters, claiming to be servants of noble houses, looking for promising children to train, or merchants offering apprenticeships, or religious figures seeking novices for monasteries or convents. These disguises made them harder to detect and easier for children to trust. Your parents had taught you to respect authority figures, and kidnappers exploited that conditioning. The festivals and market days that should have been celebrations were hunting grounds for child traffickers. Large crowds distracted parents, children, wandering freely perfect conditions for snatching victims. Some families wouldn't bring their beautiful children to these events at all, keeping them home despite the social and economic costs of missing important community gatherings. Pilgrim routes were particularly dangerous. Families travelling to religious shrines were vulnerable, exhausted away from home, surrounded by strangers. A beautiful child might be separated from family in a crowd, grabbed by watchers who'd been following the group for miles, disappearing into the mass of travellers before anyone realised what happened. Some abductions were commission-based. Someone with money, wanting a specific type of child, would pay kidnappers to acquire one matching their preferences. Beautiful blonde girls for one buyer, dark-haired boys for another, children with specific features for yet others. The market was disturbingly sophisticated and catered to varied demands. The legal system offered little help. If a child disappeared across jurisdictional boundaries which kidnappers ensured by moving victims quickly away from their origins, there was no authority with power to investigate thoroughly. Medieval justice was intensely local. A child taken from one region and sold in another was effectively beyond recovery. Some traffickers specialised in moving children internationally. A beautiful child taken in France might end up in Spain or Italy or even North Africa. The further from home, the more impossible recovery became, and the more exotic the child's appearance in their destination, the more valuable they became. Northern children in Mediterranean markets, for instance, commanded premium prices. There are scattered accounts of recovered children, usually through extraordinary luck or persistence. A parent who happened to spot their child in a distant city years later a buyer with conscience who returned a child to their region, a victim who escaped and somehow found their way home. But these stories are rare enough to be remarkable, which tells you how uncommon recovery was. The psychological impact on recovered children was profound. Years in captivity trained into servitude or worse, then suddenly returned to families they barely remembered. There was no infrastructure for helping traumatized children, no concept of therapy. They'd been stolen, broken, and returned damaged in ways their medieval world couldn't understand or treat. Most kidnapped children were never recovered. They disappeared into the medieval economy's dark underworld, their beauty having transformed them from children with families and futures into commodities with price tags. Their parents lived the rest of their lives not knowing, wondering if their child was alive, suffering dead, whether they'd been close enough to save them, if only they'd noticed faster. You're lying in your bed tonight and your mother's checked the door 3 times. Tomorrow she's taking you to have your hair cut short and your face dirtied with ash before you go to market. She's heard about disappearances in the next village and she's not taking chances. You're beautiful, which means you're valuable, which means you're at risk. The door is barred, but both of you know that bars only work when you're safely inside. And tomorrow you'll have to go outside where the men with lists are always watching. St. Agatha was beautiful, the stories say, which is why the Roman prefect wanted her. When she refused him, he had her tortured, her breasts cut off, her body broken. The medieval church held her up as a model of holy virtue. The message was clear. A truly virtuous, beautiful woman should be willing to die, even to be mutilated rather than submit to the desires her beauty provoked. Sanctity required the destruction of beauty one way or another. Welcome to the paradox of beautiful female saints in medieval Christianity. The Church produced story after story of exceptionally beautiful holy women, but their beauty was always a problem to be overcome, destroyed, or miraculously removed. Beauty and holiness were fundamentally incompatible, and the path to sainthood for beautiful women typically ran through disfigurement, suffering, or death. Look at the pattern in medieval hagiographies, the lives of saints. St. Lucy was so beautiful that a pagan suitor wanted to marry her. She refused, dedicated herself to Christ, and according to legend gouged out her own eyes to discourage his attention. The missing eyes were then miraculously restored by God, but the message landed better to blind yourself than allow beauty to cause sin. St. Wilgefortis, whose very existence is historically questionable, but whose story was widely believed, was a Portuguese princess whose beauty attracted an unwanted suitor. She prayed to become ugly so she could preserve her virginity and dedication to Christ. God answered by giving her a full beard, making her so repulsive that the suitor lost interest. Her father had her crucified for refusing marriage. The Church celebrated this as miraculous intervention. The logic was consistent across dozens of these stories. Female beauty attracts male desire leads to sin, therefore beauty itself is spiritually dangerous. A woman who wanted to be holy needed to escape, transcend, or destroy her beauty. There was no model for being both beautiful and saintly simultaneously. St. Catherine of Siena reportedly cut off her hair and scarred her face to discourage her family's marriage plans and prove her dedication to religious life. The self-mutilation was presented as evidence of her spiritual seriousness. She wasn't vain, you see, she was willing to destroy the thing worldly people valued to pursue what God valued. Historians still argue about how much these hagiographies reflected actual practices versus serving as morality tales. But the stories were widely circulated, read aloud in churches, illustrated in manuscripts. Medieval girls absorbed these messages. Your beauty is an obstacle to holiness, and the holy women who preceded you had to destroy or transcend their looks to achieve sanctity. The virgin martyrs were particularly focused on beauty. St. Agnes, St. Cecilia, Saint Barbara, all described as exceptionally beautiful, all refusing marriage or sexual submission, all tortured and killed. Their beauty was the catalyst for their martyrdom. If they'd been plain, the logic went, they wouldn't have attracted the attention that led to their persecution and ultimate sainthood. This created an impossible standard. To be a holy woman, you needed to be willing to sacrifice your beauty, even your life, to preserve your virginity and devotion to God. But you also needed to be beautiful enough in the first place that such sacrifice was meaningful. Plain women who remained virgins weren't celebrated the same way they hadn't overcome the same temptation, because they hadn't attracted the same dangerous attention. The male saints notably didn't face the same requirement. St. Augustine was reportedly handsome, but his beauty never needed to be destroyed or overcome for him to achieve holiness. Male beauty was compatible with sanctity in ways female beauty absolutely was not. The double standard was baked into the theological framework. Some medieval mystics reported visions where Christ appeared to them and praised their beauty, but spiritual beauty, the beauty of the soul, explicitly contrasted with physical appearance. The message was that inner beauty and outer beauty were inverse. The more beautiful your soul, the less your body should matter. Focusing on physical appearance was vanity. True holiness required indifference to or active rejection of bodily beauty. The cult of the Virgin Mary created some complexity here. Mary was often depicted as beautiful in medieval art, the ideal of feminine perfection. But she was also perpetually Virgin Mother without sexual contamination, human, but specially blessed beyond normal human constraints. She was beautiful, but somehow not dangerous, because her beauty was divinely sanctioned and contained. Ordinary beautiful women couldn't claim that exception. Convents sometimes practiced deliberate degradation of beauty as spiritual discipline. Beautiful novices might be required to wear especially plain or ugly habits, to avoid washing, to engage in work that would damage their complexion and hands. The goal was killing vanity and pride, but the assumption that beautiful women were necessarily vain was rarely questioned. There's a documented practice in some strict orders of nuns sleeping in their habits, never fully undressing, avoiding mirrors entirely. For beautiful women, this was supposed to help them forget their appearance, to stop thinking of themselves as bodies at all. Whether this actually worked or just created different psychological problems is an open question. The few medieval female saints who were celebrated while still alive and beautiful were almost always mystics or visionaries, women whose beauty was explicitly framed as irrelevant compared to their direct communication with God. And even then, their beauty created problems. Male clergy would question whether visions were genuine or whether the woman was using her looks to manipulate attention. St. Teresa of Avila wrote about the constant scrutiny she faced, the suspicions that her visions were vanity or demonic deception. While not described as exceptionally beautiful, she was aware that being female and claiming divine visions automatically made her suspect. Beauty would have made that suspicion exponentially worse. The medieval church's obsession with beautiful female martyrs reveals a dark fascination with the destruction of beauty. The stories linger on the details of torture, of bodies broken and beauty destroyed. There's an almost fetishistic quality to descriptions of saints' sufferings, their beautiful bodies mutilated, their lovely faces destroyed, all for the glory of God. Modern scholars sometimes analyze this as a way medieval men could imaginatively possess and destroy female beauty, simultaneously celebrating it, while ensuring it was safely contained through suffering and death. The beautiful saint was the ultimate male fantasy, a woman beautiful enough to desire suffering in ways that neutralized that desire and dead, so she couldn't actually threaten or reject anyone. For living medieval women, these stories created impossible pressures. If you were beautiful and wanted to be considered virtuous, you needed to constantly demonstrate that you weren't vain, weren't using your looks manipulatively, weren't proud of your appearance. You needed to perform humility about your beauty, while also not appearing to fish for compliments through false modesty. Some genuinely pious, beautiful women struggled deeply with this. They wanted to serve God, but were constantly told their faces were obstacles. They tried to minimize their appearance, but were accused of false humility. They couldn't win because the system was designed to make beauty and virtue incompatible. The really dark implication was that beautiful women who died young from disease, childbirth, violence were sometimes framed as almost fortunate. They'd escaped the dangers their beauty posed before it could fully destroy them or others. Early death was better than living long enough to cause sin. This was presented as consolation to grieving families. At least she died beautiful and pure before the world corrupted her. You're kneeling in church tonight looking at the painting of St. Agatha on the wall. Her beautiful face is serene despite the torture depicted her severed breasts offered on a platter like some grotesque gift. This is your model for holiness, a woman so beautiful she had to be destroyed to become sacred. You pray, but you're not sure anymore what you're praying for. To be holy, to be safe, to be ugly, to simply survive in a world where the church that's supposed to protect you keeps telling stories about how women like you are better off mutilated or dead. The troubadour is singing in the great hall and everyone's listening with rapt attention. It's a love story, a beautiful maiden pursued by an evil lord, rescued by a brave knight married in glory. The audience sighs at the romance. You're serving wine and listening to, but you're hearing a different story. You're hearing about a girl who had no choice, who was property fought over by men whose beauty made her the object of a conflict she didn't start and couldn't control. The story treats this as romance. You know it as horror. Medieval literature was obsessed with beautiful women, and almost every story involving them ended badly. Courtly romances, epic poems, cautionary tales, religious allegories across all genres, exceptional beauty in women was presented as inherently tragic. Literature both reflected and reinforced the cultural message: beauty brings suffering, destruction, and death. The courtly love tradition was particularly insidious. Knights worshipped beautiful ladies from afar, wrote poetry about them, performed deeds in their honour. This sounds romantic until you realise the lady in question was essentially a decorative object in someone else's narrative. Her beauty inspired the action, but she herself rarely had agency. She was the prize, the motivation, the symbol, never the protagonist of her own story. And what happened to these beautiful literary women? Let's catalogue the fates. Helen of Troy. Her beauty caused a war that killed thousands. Guinevere, her beauty and adultery destroyed Camelot. Isolde, her beauty led to a doomed love affair that killed both lovers. Eurydice lost to the underworld. Ophelia, driven mad, drowned. The pattern is relentless. Beauty leads to tragedy. Medieval audiences consume these stories and internalize their messages. If you were a beautiful girl listening to these tales, you learned that women like you were cursed, that your looks would inevitably lead to disaster, that the best you could hope for was being a passive object in someone else's heroic narrative before meeting your inevitable doom. The fairy tales were even worse in some ways. Beautiful princesses locked in towers, cursed by witches, put into enchanted sleep. Their beauty made them targets for magical malevolence and the happy endings. Being rescued by a prince who'd never spoken to them, waking up married to a stranger, their beauty having served its purpose as a reward for male heroism. Historians still argue about how much medieval people believed these stories were real versus understanding them as symbolic or entertaining fiction. But the cultural impact was undeniable. These narratives shaped expectations and reinforced existing beliefs about beauty's dangerous nature. The beautiful maiden in distress trope taught that beautiful women were inherently helpless, requiring male protection and rescue. But it also taught that such women attracted danger specifically because of their looks. Dragons didn't kidnap plain girls. Evil sorcerers didn't curse homely princesses. Beauty was the beacon that called forth catastrophe. Some stories featured beautiful women who used their looks strategically. Delilah, Judith, various seductresses and manipulators. But these were explicitly villainous characters. A beautiful woman with agency was by definition dangerous and probably evil. Good, beautiful women were passive victims. Active, beautiful women were threats. The Metamorphosis tales were particularly revealing. Beautiful women transformed into animals, trees, or stones, as punishment or protection. Daphne turned into a laurel tree to escape Apollo's pursuit. Medusa transformed into a monster, her beauty becoming literally deadly. The message female beauty is so disruptive that transformation into non-human form is sometimes the only solution. Medieval beast fables often featured beautiful women as the cause of conflict between male animals. Two stags fighting over a doe bulls competing for cows. These stories were transparent metaphors with the beautiful female as the catalyst for male violence, but bearing no responsibility for starting or stopping it. The religious literature was blunter. Beautiful women in moral tales were temptresses, often literally in league with the devil. Their beauty was the bait in supernatural traps designed to catch virtuous men's souls. The beautiful woman offering her body was actually offering damnation. The visual appeal of her flesh was a mask over spiritual corruption. There's a whole genre of medieval stories about hermits or monks tempted by beautiful women, sometimes real women, sometimes demonic apparitions in female form. The moral was always the same: beauty is a test of faith, and succumbing to it means spiritual death. The women themselves barely counted as characters, they were just ambulatory temptations. Some courtly romances did give beautiful women more complex roles. Isolde makes choices, Guinevere has desires. Eleanor of Aquitaine appears as a political actor in contemporary chronicles. But even these more developed characters were still primarily defined by their beauty and its effects on men. Their agency existed within extremely narrow parameters. The medieval romance of patient Griselda, a beautiful peasant woman who endures horrible treatment from her noble husband to prove her virtue, is held up as an ideal of womanhood. She accepts being publicly stripped, having her children taken away, being divorced and humiliated, all without complaint. Her beauty attracted the noble's attention, and her patient suffering of his cruelty was presented as admirable. This was the literary model of how beautiful women should behave. The tales specifically warned about peasant beauty. A beautiful peasant girl in literature almost always came to a bad end, seduced and abandoned by nobility, driven mad by impossible love, dying tragically young. The message to real beautiful peasant girls was clear: your beauty has placed you in a genre that ends in suffering. Literature also reinforced class anxiety about beauty. Stories of knights falling for beautiful peasants who turn out to be secretly noble. The beauty was proof of hidden aristocratic blood couldn't possibly be natural in a common woman. This taught that genuine, exceptional beauty indicated high birth. So if you were beautiful and poor, you must be lying about your origins, or there must be a scandal in your ancestry. The troubadour poetry that celebrated beautiful women was written entirely by men for male audiences expressing male desires and anxieties. The beautiful women in these poems were idealized, objectified, often explicitly compared to inanimate objects of value: gems, flowers, precious metals. They weren't people. They were exquisite things to be admired, possessed, or mourned. Even the happy endings in medieval romance were dubious for beautiful women. Marriage to a powerful lord meant becoming property-bearing children, in an era of high maternal mortality, living under a husband's complete authority. The stories end with the wedding, but real women knew that's where their real troubles began. Medieval drama presented beautiful women as inherently theatrical. Their beauty itself was a kind of performance that invited male gaze and commentary. Mystery plays and morality plays often featured beautiful female characters as representations of worldly temptation. The actress playing lust or vanity would be chosen for her beauty, which was part of the theological point being made. Some literature did acknowledge the burden of beauty. There are poems where beautiful women lament their looks, wish they were plain, express fear of the attention they attract. But even these are written by men imagining female experience rather than reflecting it. And the conclusion was usually resignation. Beauty is your cross to bear your ordained suffering. You finish serving and slip back to the servants' quarters while the troubadour continues his tale. He's singing now about the beautiful maiden's grateful love for her rescuer, how she pledged herself to him forever after he saved her from the villain. The audience applauds. You think about the real beautiful maidens, the ones caught between powerful men with no rescue, coming just survival and compromise, and hoping you don't end up as a cautionary tale in someone else's story. Literature turned your life into tragedy and called it romance. You know the difference, but nobody asked you to write it down. You're 16 and you're standing in the manor courtyard. The nobleman's son has decided he wants you not for marriage. Obviously you're a peasant. But he's seen you working in the kitchens and he's made his interest known to your father. Your father, who owns nothing, who holds his land at the Lord's pleasure, who could be evicted or worse on a whim, is trying to figure out how to refuse without destroying the family. He can't. You both know he can't. Your beauty has erased every choice. Class crossing was the most dangerous aspect of medieval beauty because it created situations where normal social protections completely evaporated. If a nobleman wanted a peasant girl, he had the power to take her, and the systems that might theoretically protect her family law, community collapsed under the weight of feudal hierarchy. The feudal system was built on stark power imbalances. Lords owned the land, peasants worked it. Lords dispensed justice, peasants received it. Lords made laws, peasants followed them. In this structure, a beautiful peasant girl who caught a noble's eye had entered nightmare with no exits. Let's be clear about what interest meant. Sometimes it meant a genuine, if inappropriate, infatuation. The nobleman wanted you as a mistress, might even offer some compensation or security. More often it meant temporary sexual access. He wanted to use you and discard you, and your consent wasn't part of the equation he was calculating. Your father's position is impossible. Refuse and he risks the Lord's anger, eviction. From his land-holding, false accusations, leading to punishment, economic retaliation, through increased rents or labour requirements or simple violence. Medieval lords had tremendous latitude to punish peasants, and a peasant who denied a lord's desire could be crushed in dozens of ways. But agree, and he's effectively selling his daughter. You'll be used probably repeatedly, and then what best case you become a recognised mistress with some status and protection. Middle case, you're discarded once the nobleman loses interest, possibly pregnant, definitely ruined for marriage within your own class. Worst case, you're used violently, disposed of, and your family can't even seek justice because your abuser outranks you legally and socially. Some fathers tried negotiation, seeking promises of money, better land terms, assurance of care if you became pregnant. This was a desperate attempt to extract some value from a transaction they couldn't prevent. But nobles rarely honoured such agreements. Once they'd gotten what they wanted, peasants had no leverage to enforce promises. The community would know what happened. In a medieval village, privacy didn't exist. Everyone would know you'd been taken by the Lord's son, and everyone would have opinions. Some would pity you. Others would envy the attention or assume you'd encouraged it. Many would simply note that you were no longer marriageable within normal channels, that your beauty had elevated you into a category, a part neither peasant nor noble just used. Historians still argue about how common sexual exploitation across class lines actually was versus how much it's been sensationalized, but the legal and social structures made it disturbingly easy. A nobleman faced essentially no legal consequences for sexually exploiting peasant women. The worst that might happen was social disapproval from peers who thought he should show more restraint. Some peasant girls who became noble mistresses actually achieved unusual social mobility. If you were clever lucky and the relationship lasted, you might secure property money or advantageous marriages for your siblings. The mistress of a powerful lord had more influence than most peasant women could dream of. But this was the exception, not the rule, and it required extraordinary circumstances. More commonly, you'd be used for a few months or years, then discarded when the nobleman married someone appropriate to his class or simply grew bored. You'd return to your village pregnant or with a ruined reputation, and your life options would have narrowed dramatically. No respectable peasant would marry you now, so you might end up as a servant or in sex work or dependent on your family's charity, if they'd even take you back. The children born from these liaisons were in a legal and social limbo. Illegitimate offspring of nobles had no inheritance rights, no claim on their father's name or protection. If the father acknowledged them at all, he might provide some minimal support. More often they were just another peasant child with a mysterious background and a mother whose beauty had destroyed her life. Some noblemen specifically sought out beautiful peasant girls because they could be used without the complications that came with noble women. A peasant had no powerful family to avenge her honour, no legal standing to press charges, no social network that could create consequences. She was vulnerable in ways that made her paradoxically attractive to predators. The droit du seigneur, the supposed right of the feudal lord to sleep with peasant brides on their wedding night, is historically controversial. Scholars debate whether it was ever actually a legal right or just a myth, but the fact that such a concept existed in popular imagination tells you something about the perceived relationship between noble power and peasant women's bodies. Even if formal droit du seigneur didn't exist, informal versions certainly did. Lords could and did demand sexual access to peasant women on their lands, justifying it through various pretexts, or simply not bothering to justify it at all. The power imbalance made resistance suicidal. Some peasant families tried to hide their beautiful daughters when nobility visited, keeping them in back rooms, sending them to relatives, disguising them. But this was difficult to sustain long-term, and it marked you as special in ways that could actually increase interest. Why are they hiding that girl? She must be worth seeing. The very few cases where peasant families successfully resisted noble sexual demands usually involved some special circumstance. The peasant had a skill the lord desperately needed, and used that leverage, or the lord's own family intervened fearing scandal, or the church interceded on rare occasions when the exploitation was too blatant to ignore. But these cases were exceptional enough to be memorable, which tells you how rare successful resistance was. The normal outcome was submission, because the alternative was destruction. You could lose your virtue or lose your family's livelihood, and possibly their lives. That's not a choice. It's a forced surrender. Some beautiful peasant girls ran away rather than submit, fleeing to cities where they might disappear into urban anonymity, or to convents if they had the means, or just into the forests and roads to take their chances with different dangers. Running away meant abandoning family, community, everything you knew, but for some anything was better than what awaited. The legal system offered no meaningful recourse. Theoretically, you could bring charges of rape or assault. Practically, a peasant accusing a nobleman would face impossible burdens of proof, likely retaliation, and judges drawn from the same noble class as your abuser. The system protected power, not justice. Even if you had witnesses, even if the evidence was clear, even if the nobleman essentially admitted what he'd done, his word counted more than yours. He was born to rule, you were born to serve. That hierarchy was ordained by God, according to medieval thinking, and disrupting it by actually punishing a noble for abusing a peasant threatened the entire social order. Some priests tried to intervene in the worst cases, using spiritual authority to pressure nobles toward restraint. But priests themselves were often from noble families or dependent on noble patronage. A priest who seriously challenged a lord's behaviour might find himself transferred or worse. The rare clergymen who consistently defended peasant women against noble exploitation are remembered as exceptional, specifically because they were so unusual. The psychological damage to girls caught in these situations was profound. You went from being a person with hopes and plans to being an object that powerful men fought over or used. Your beauty, which should have been just a feature, had reduced you to a commodity. And unlike actual commodities, you could feel every moment of your objectification. You're lying in bed tonight and you heard your father and the Lord Steward talking this afternoon. Arrangements are being made. In a few days you'll be expected to present yourself at the manor house. Your mother's been crying. Your siblings won't look at you. Your beauty has turned you into a sacrifice that your family is offering to protect themselves. You're 16. You've never kissed anyone, and you're about to learn that in the medieval world being beautiful and poor meant your body was never really yours at all. You're 42 years old, and something has shifted. The baker's son who used to stare doesn't anymore. The nobleman who made your life dangerous has moved to a different estate, and his replacement hasn't noticed you. You can walk through the market without feeling eyes tracking your movement. It's not that you're ugly now, you're just older, and your beauty has faded enough that you've slipped below the threshold of dangerous visibility. For the first time since childhood, you feel something unexpected relief. Medieval beauty was tied ruthlessly to youth. The same features that made you a target at 16 made you invisible at 40. And for many women who'd survived the dangers of exceptional beauty, aging wasn't decline, it was liberation. The loss of beauty was the gain of safety, and the trade-off felt like mercy. The medieval ideal of beauty was aggressively young, smooth skin, bright eyes, full cheeks, strong hair. These traits peaked in the teens and early 20s. By 30 you were past your prime. By 40 you were aging out of the danger zone. By 50 you were safely invisible in the way that had been impossible when you were young. This invisibility came with real benefits. Men stopped propositioning you. The jealous wives who'd made your life difficult lost interest because you were no longer a threat. Accusations of witchcraft or evil eye became less likely because you no longer had the striking features that attracted such suspicions. You could finally just exist without your face being an event. The marriage market had closed decades ago, but if you'd survived this long unmarried, you'd developed other survival strategies, work skills, community relationships, perhaps a small business. Now you could pursue these without constant interference. Your face had stopped being your defining feature, and other aspects of your personhood could finally emerge. Historians still argue about whether medieval women experienced aging as liberation or loss, and the answer probably varied enormously by individual circumstance. But for women whose beauty had been primarily dangerous rather than advantageous, there's evidence that aging brought genuine psychological relief. Some women mark the transition explicitly. There are references in personal letters and diaries to women expressing gratitude for losing their looks, thanking God for the wrinkles and grey hair that made them less noticeable. This wasn't false modesty, it was genuine appreciation for escaping a lifetime of unwanted attention. The physical changes came gradually but cumulatively. Your skin lost elasticity, developing wrinkles around eyes and mouth. Your hair thinned and greyed. Your body thickened, losing the slim proportions of youth. Each change was another step towards safety, another layer of protection against the male gaze that had endangered you for decades. Medieval medicine ironically had predicted this. Remember those physicians who warned that beauty indicated dangerous humoral imbalances that would lead to early death? Well, If you survived to middle age, you'd proven them wrong, and in aging out of beauty, you'd paradoxically achieved what they considered better health, a more balanced, less extreme physical presentation. The work you could do changed too. Beautiful young women were limited to positions where their looks were either an asset or could be carefully controlled. Older women had more options. You could be a midwife now, a position of respect that required experience rather than appearance. You could run a business without constant assumptions about how you'd really earned your money. The social dynamics transformed. Other women who'd viewed you as competition or threat for years could finally relax around you. You might develop genuine friendships that had been impossible when your beauty created jealousy barriers. The community of older women could finally accept you as one of them, rather than an outsider whose face disrupted social equilibrium. Some women who'd been beautiful in youth became the harsh enforcers of beauty standards for the next generation. The mother-in-law criticizing the young bride, the older nun punishing the pretty novice. There's a sad psychology here. They'd suffered for their beauty, and part of them needed younger, beautiful women to suffer too. The cycle of resentment perpetuated itself, but others became protectors. Having survived the dangers of beauty, they recognized the same dangers in younger women and tried to help. The older woman who quietly advised a beautiful girl to cover her hair, to avoid certain streets, to be careful around specific men, she was passing down survival knowledge earned through hard experience. The relief of aging out of beauty was sometimes tinged with complicated feelings. You'd lost something that society valued, even if that thing had endangered you. You were safer, but also more dismissible. People no longer saw you at all, which was protective but also alienating. You'd traded one problem for another, though most women who'd been dangerously beautiful seemed to prefer invisibility to visibility. There's some evidence that formerly beautiful women lived longer on average than women who'd been plain. This seems counterintuitive given all the dangers beauty posed, but it might reflect selection bias. The beautiful women who survived to 40 had to be extremely clever, careful, and lucky. They developed survival skills that served them well in later life. Medieval culture had some respect for older women that it denied to beautiful young ones. A woman past childbearing age was less sexualized, less threatening to social order, less likely to be seen as a temptation or disruption. You couldn't be accused of seducing men when men no longer found you seductive. It was objectification's opposite extreme, but at least it was safer. The widow status was particularly interesting. If you'd been married, especially if your husband had been respected, you inherited some of his social standing, plus your own experience. Widows could run businesses, manage property, and exercise authority in ways that young, beautiful women never could. Your beauty's absence was part of what made this authority possible. Some formerly beautiful women reported feeling more themselves for the first time in decades. When your face stopped dominating how people perceived you, other qualities could finally be noticed. Your intelligence skills, humor, wisdom. These had always been present, but beauty had overshadowed everything else. Now finally people could see you rather than just your face. Religious communities sometimes welcomed aging beauties differently than they'd welcomed young ones. An older woman joining a convent wasn't suspected of running from marriage prospects or being dumped there by embarrassed families. She could be seen as genuinely seeking spiritual life because the worldly attractions had faded. Her aging face was proof of serious intent. The grandchildren, if you had them, saw you differently than your own children had. They didn't remember you beautiful and dangerous. To them, you were just Grandma Soft-Safe familiar. There was something healing about being loved, without beauty being part of the equation, being valued for comfort and care rather than appearance. There's a poignant detail in some medieval sources. Women who'd been beautiful in youth sometimes kept tokens or memories of their former looks, a piece of jewellery from an admirer, a letter describing their beauty, a polished metal mirror. not from vanity but as evidence of survival. See this, I was beautiful once. I was endangered. I survived. I'm still here. The fear never completely disappeared. Even at 40, 50, 60, you'd startle at sudden male attention, your body remembering decades of hypervigilance. But those moments became rarer. Mostly you could walk through the world without your face being a problem. Mostly you were just another older woman in a world full of them. You're sitting by the fire tonight and your hands are rough from work and your hair is grey and there are lines around your eyes that will never smooth out. You look at your reflection in the bucket of water, the same bucket where 30 years ago you saw the beauty emerging that would define and endanger the next decades of your life. That girl in the reflection is gone and you miss her not at all. Because she survived, transformed into you, and you are finally blessedly safe enough to just be human. The stories persist. 500 years later, we still tell fairy tales about beautiful maidens in danger, still write stories where exceptional looks bring tragedy, still unconsciously absorb the medieval message that beauty is both gift and curse. The anxieties that made medieval life dangerous for beautiful people haven't disappeared. They've just changed costume, adapted to new times, found new expressions in different social structures. Think about what we've traced through these hours together. We've watched beauty intersect with church suspicion, witchcraft accusations, forced marriages, community jealousy, workplace harassment, legal persecution, kidnapping, impossible religious standards, literary objectification, class exploitation, and finally the complicated relief of aging out of danger. Every medieval social structure found a way to make beauty dangerous. The medieval world's particular brutality toward beautiful people came from the intersection of several factors that all peaked simultaneously. Rigid social hierarchy meant beautiful people who didn't fit their class created category problems. Religious paranoia meant exceptional features were read as spiritual signs, usually bad ones. Limited mobility and privacy meant you couldn't escape your community's judgment. Legal systems favoured the powerful, leaving beautiful victims without recourse. And underlying everything was the fundamental medieval conviction that physical beauty and spiritual goodness were incompatible in women. Historians looking at this period debate whether beautiful people actually suffered more than others, or whether they just appear more often in records because their beauty made them memorable. But the sheer consistency of the pattern suggests this wasn't just documentation bias. Beauty genuinely attracted danger in ways that touched every aspect of medieval life. The gender dimension is impossible to ignore. Beautiful men face some similar issues being noticed, being desired, being objectified, but the specific dangers were dramatically different. Beautiful men weren't typically accused of witchcraft, for their looks weren't forcibly married against their will, at 12 weren't blamed for causing community misfortune through the evil eye, weren't systematically sexualized and exploited by those with power over them. Medieval beauty standards themselves were narrower than we might imagine. The ideal was young, pale-skinned, slender, but not too thin, with specific proportions that were considered divinely ordained. If you happened to match that template, you entered the danger zone. But the template was exclusive enough that most people fell outside it, which meant the dangers of exceptional beauty were concentrated on a relatively small percentage of the population who became hypervisible. Some beautiful medieval people undoubtedly leveraged their looks successfully, navigating the dangers to achieve security, power, or happiness. The historical record preserves some of these stories: the mistress who became politically influential, the beautiful peasant who married well, the servant who caught a kind employer's eye. But survivorship bias makes these stories prominent, while the countless tragedies disappeared into unmarked graves and forgotten pain. The medieval response to beauty's dangers ranged from individual strategies to systemic solutions. Individuals tried hiding disfigurement, strategic marriages, or simply enduring. Communities developed sumptuary laws, prostitution regulations, and social surveillance. The Church produced theological frameworks for understanding and containing beauty's disruptive potential, but none of these responses actually solved the underlying problem. They just managed it, distributed it, or pushed it onto the beautiful people themselves to handle. There's something deeply sad about a society that saw beauty as a problem requiring management, rather than simply a human variation to be accepted. The medieval worldview couldn't accommodate exceptional beauty without seeing it as a threat to order, a challenge to hierarchy, a spiritual danger, or a resource to be controlled. The idea that beautiful people could just exist without being symbols, objects, or threats was apparently unthinkable. The long shadow of medieval beauty anxiety still touches modern life. When we tell girls their looks will bring them trouble, when we sexualize beauty while simultaneously shaming it, when we treat exceptional appearance as both valuable and dangerous, we're echoing medieval patterns. The specific dangers have changed. We don't burn witches or force child marriages anymore. At least not in most places, but the underlying discomfort with beauty remains. Modern discussions about appearance objectification, the male gaze, beauty standards, and social media attention often unknowingly retread medieval territory. The conviction that being looked at is inherently dangerous for women, the sense that beauty attracts predators, the pressure to be attractive but not too attractive, the way beauty can simultaneously open and close doors, these are medieval problems dressed in contemporary clothing. What makes the medieval period particularly instructive is how explicitly the culture articulated its anxieties. Medieval people didn't hide their belief that beauty was dangerous. They built legal systems, religious doctrines, and social practices around that belief. Modern culture is sometimes more subtle, but the underlying currents are similar. We've just gotten better at pretending beauty is uncomplicated, while maintaining structures that prove we think otherwise. For the medieval people who actually lived through this, who were beautiful in a world that found beauty threatening, the experience was exhausting, traumatic, and frequently tragic. You didn't ask for your face, you didn't choose your features, but you spent your entire life managing the consequences of genetics you couldn't control, navigating dangers you didn't create, and surviving systems designed to contain, exploit, or punish you for how you looked. Some survived better than others. Some found safety in marriage convents or aging. Some never found safety at all. Some were destroyed young, becoming cautionary tales or forgotten victims. Some adapted so thoroughly to their dangerous visibility that hypervigilance became their permanent state, carried even into contexts where beauty no longer threatened them. The question of whether it was worth it, whether the benefits of beauty outweighed its dangers, probably varied enormously by individual circumstance. A beautiful nobleman with family protection might genuinely benefit from her looks despite the complications. A beautiful peasant orphan almost certainly suffered far more than she gained. Class, family geography, historical moment, and sheer luck determined whether beauty was asset or liability, or both simultaneously. What's universal is that medieval beautiful people didn't get to opt out. You couldn't choose to be plain. You couldn't refuse your face. You were stuck with the genetic hand you'd been dealt, and society's response to that hand shaped your entire life in ways that people who fell into more acceptable appearance categories never experienced. So here we are hours later, having traced beauty's dark journey through medieval Europe. We've seen how a face could doom you from childhood, how every social institution found ways to make beauty dangerous, how survival required constant vigilance and painful compromise. We've watched beauty intersect with power, religion, law, superstition, and violence, always with the same result: the beautiful person paying costs they never agreed to and couldn't escape. The fire has burned low and the night outside is quiet. You've travelled through centuries of pain tonight through stories of people whose only crime was being born with faces that pleased the eye. It's heavy material, all this suffering compressed into jeans and cheekbones and the curve of a mouth. But here's what matters as you drift towards sleep: those people survived. Not all of them, not most of them, but enough. Enough to have descendants to pass on their stories, to leave traces in the historical record that let us know they existed and struggled and endured. The medieval world tried in countless ways to punish, contain, exploit or destroy beautiful people, and many individuals didn't make it through. But beauty itself persisted generation after generation, proof that even the most hostile systems couldn't completely eliminate what they feared. And maybe there's something quietly hopeful in that persistence. The medieval conviction that beauty was dangerous didn't make beauty disappear. The systems designed to manage it didn't succeed in containing it. The punishments didn't prevent it from emerging again in new generations. Human variation continued regardless of how much anxiety it provoked or how much violence was directed at managing it. The people we've spent tonight with the servant girls and peasants and unwilling brides, the accused witches and disfigured daughters and aging widows, they lived in circumstances we can barely imagine, enduring dangers we're privileged to only encounter in history. But they lived. They found moments of joy between the dangers, built relationships despite the complications, discovered strength in the face of systems designed to break them. And eventually the night always ended. The sun rose on another day. The beautiful people who'd survived got up and did what survivors do, continued, adapted, endured. Not because it was heroic or romantic, but because the alternative was giving up. And humans are remarkably stubborn about continuing even when continuation is hard. So let the stories settle now. Let the weight of all those centuries of struggle sink gently away. You're safe in your bed, far from medieval dangers in a world that's still complicated, but at least doesn't burn witches or force child marriages or blame crop failures on pretty faces. The beautiful people of medieval Europe lived and died and struggled so their descendants could inherit a slightly less hostile world. And now, finally, you can rest. The history is told. The dangers are explained. The patterns are traced. Close your eyes and let it all fade, the castles and convents, the markets and manor houses, the faces beautiful enough to be dangerous, and the systems cruel enough to punish them for it. Sleep well. The medieval world is long gone. You made it through the night. The story ends here. See you in the next video. Good night.